It so happened that the whole world was consumed by despair, and this came as a great surprise to everyone. Humanity has never encountered anything like this before. People fell into unprecedented chaos, encountering terrible creatures that had never been seen before. The mysterious civilization demanded that the citizens be handed over if they wanted to live, but the UN refused this demand. The US leadership stated that the monsters want to use people as food. They should not give in to them. People began to call the creatures that appeared out of nowhere the attractors of misfortune. In order to deal with an unfriendly enemy, people began to use nuclear weapons. But for the monsters, it was a mere trifle. Like a bright firework, they did not suffer from it. The monsters began to take revenge, and in response to nuclear weapons began to dance on the ruins of destroyed cities. And when all hope was lost, when every man was waiting for the hour of his death, they appeared. 13 constellations. 12 were chosen by the gods and were called saints. Each of them used the powers granted by the god who chose him. And the 13th was an awakened one. He was not chosen by any divine being. It was Li Gang. They came to the Demon Tower to defeat Red Eye, who was considered the root of all evil. Li Gang and the 12 other constellations clashed with Red Eyes because they understood that there was no other way out of the situation. The journalists were very surprised because not everyone returned from the trip to the demonic tower. They wondered if something terrible had happened to the Korean hero, Li Gang. A disheveled man with a bandage on his face said that Li Gang sacrificed himself for the good of humanity. The young man did risk his life, but he did not sacrifice himself. Li Gang, although with difficulty, was able to defeat Red-Eyed, but the 12 comrades who were with him turned out to be real bastards. They actually ran away and left Li Gang alone, even though he was able to win. The young man was very disappointed by this action of the 12 constellations, because they all went to the Demon Tower together. One of the escaped scumbags stabbed Li in the back with a dagger and left him to die in some hole. The young man was not lonely, because a nasty creature was assigned next to him. Li Gang was very badly injured. His left arm was cut off, and his right arm was very badly injured, and it would have been easier for him to die. But the young man is not so easy to sink, and he will not die just like that. Li Gang knew that he would live until he found everyone who dared to betray him, and he would come for them very soon. There were some delicious breaded drumsticks on the table, and a young man turned to Li Gang and asked him to listen to him carefully. The holy sign of Sagittarius Hugo Otis told the boy that he was destined to die tomorrow. Li Gang was very surprised and asked the guy if he really had such a low opinion of him. The guy took a chicken drumstick in each hand and said that he was talking to him like that because he had taken both legs for himself. The man looked at Li Gang and told him that he was saying his name wrong. Li Gang replied that he understood the reason for the boy's worries and told him not to worry, because he definitely would not die. He took a bite of the meat and said that he had killed more misfortune-attracting creatures than all 12 constellations combined, and asked the boy if he really thought Li could die. The man who was sitting opposite the boy folded his hands in front of him and looked closely at the young man. The Demon Tower is the home of the strongest monster that can bring death to all of humanity. It all started on the last day of the 20th century. A powerful temptation of misfortunes drove humanity into a corner with its overwhelming power. They left behind only chaos and pitch darkness, and it was during this period that the 12 gods appeared, who called themselves sacred beings. They vowed to give humanity the power to fight off all monsters and chose 12 people who was granted indescribable power. But something happened that no one expected. The 13th awakened appeared, without the blessing of a single sacred entity. He was so strong and so incredible that everyone was shocked by his abilities. The surprising thing was that even among the 12 saints he had no equal, and this fact made them very angry. And who was so strong, incredible, and unique? Of course, a young man named Li Gang. The guy thanked Gan for the fact that thanks to him, they were able to organize an attack on the Demon Tower. He sat down on a rock and said that words were not enough and he wanted a free supply of fried chicken for 5 years, and the other asked if Gan was tired of eating only chicken. Li mispronounced the young man's name. The boy told him this with a laugh, but Li only became angry. The girl said that after defeating Red Eyes, they would most likely receive a worthy reward, and the fat man said that they should demand $100 million. And Li noted that it would be better to ask for 10 years of free accommodation in a 7-star hotel somewhere in Hawaii. The boy noted that because of Red-Eyed, a huge number of countries are on the brink of crisis. The plump guy with a sarcastic smile asked Li if he wanted to collaborate with them and added that he needed to set the bar higher. The fat man asked if Gan wanted to take out the mutilated body and face, and Lee thought about how they were called saints, but in reality they were scum who cared about their own skin. The man said that it was enough to rush to everyone's aid, and a few victims would only increase their price, and the reward would only increase. Lee said he didn't care, but he thought he was surrounded by disgusting scum. He hoped he wouldn't see them after they dealt with the red-eyed man. The young people froze in place. They were very surprised. Beads of sweat appeared on their faces. They looked up and saw the Lord of the Demon Tower, red-eyed, standing before them. Li Gang stood to the side and thought that only by looking at him could one feel the terrible pressure. At this time, Red Eyes opened his mouth. It glowed with fire, and his crazy eyes glowed red. A very strong wind arose, and the young people who were watching all this were seriously scared. The ground beneath the young men's feet was crumbling, and Lee folded his hands in front of him and watched everything that was happening. A strong wind whirled the powerful people around in a whirlwind, and they screamed loudly in horror. Red-Eyed was very angry, because uninvited guests had come to his territory. The entity gritted its teeth, gnashing them, and fiery lava burst from its mouth. The girl's face was covered in beads of sweat. Her pupils became like dots. She was shaking with fear. She was telling everyone to run away. And the young people began to run headlong. They were very scared, and someone was shouting loudly that they needed to save themselves. The young men wondered if it was possible to fight something like this, and Lee looked at it all and was only surprised that these sacks of shit were only called saints. The guy squeezed the weapon in his hands and thought that all this had no meaning for him at all. The young man decided that he would be the one to kick Red Eye's ass. Li Gang did not retreat, but fulfilled the promise he made to himself. And in the end, those who were with him stabbed him in the back. He thought about how things were in the outside world and cut up the monsters that haunted him. Lee found himself in a place that was a special trap, in which more and more hordes of monsters were constantly appearing. But Li Gang could not be taken by something like that, which his traders were counting on. The guy continued to fight and promised himself that he would survive and would definitely deal with the traders. Gan promised himself that he would tear to shreds all those scumbags who dared to betray him. 20 years have passed since then. A terrible monster appeared in front of the young man, which surprised him greatly. Gan asked how he managed to get here and then noted that he was the last one. The monster screamed at the top of its lungs and began asking if there was anyone left there. Li Gang told him that the monster could scream as much as he wanted, but it was already over for him. The monster called for help, but the guy dealt with it very quickly. He stood over the monsters and sighed heavily. Li Gang had beads of sweat on his face and said that it was finally over. The guy started walking towards the exit and happily said that now he would be able to get out of here. The city was completely destroyed. There was not a single intact house. Not a single intact road. Voices could be heard. The young man was telling the other that he had chosen a less than ideal path, and the other replied that he had been told that it was safer today than usual. The boys were very surprised that they ran into high-ranking monsters that were running after them. The young man noted that they were in deep shit and said that the fortune-teller told him that today he would meet a monster with whom he should not associate himself. The monster approached the guy. He became covered in beads of sweat and began to scream very loudly. The boy fell after the blow. He lay on the ground and groaned in pain. He felt very bad. The guys were surrounded by a huge number of monsters and they felt in danger. The young man began to rise and thought that if Li Gang had been able to return from the demonic tower, then the monsters would not have dared to even show up here. And then, as if on cue, the doors of the demonic tower began to open very slowly. The young people looked at everything that was happening with horror. Beads of sweat appeared on their faces. The boys could barely stand on their feet. A strong wind was blowing in their direction, and dirt and sand were flying straight into their faces. Suddenly, a fiery tornado appeared from which smoke and sand were pouring out. It was a terrifying sight. The young people fell to the ground. They were crushed by huge boulders. The guy asked his friend what it was. He didn't have time to answer. The young man was very surprised. He told his friend that someone was coming out of the destroyed tower. Everything was in smoke, and it was very difficult to understand who was coming out of the destroyed tower. The boy stood in front of the tower, folded his hands in front of him, and said out loud that he had been hit in the back and left to rot in this hole. Lee noted that only cattle do this, but now they won't get away with it and will pay for everything. The young people watched everything that was happening, their eyes wide open in surprise, and could not understand what was happening. And this young man, who had just left the tower, dealt with the monster very easily. The guys couldn't believe their eyes. They were surprised that Li had dealt with the dog without any difficulty. But Li Gang wasn't going to stop there. He began to destroy other monsters. The young man dealt with the monsters very quickly and was very pleased with himself. And the guys who were attacked by the monsters watched everything that was happening from the side. A few seconds later, Li Gang was already near the young people and grabbed them by the hair. They screamed in fear and pain. The guys began to ask Li not to attack them. They stuttered from fear, and Gun was very surprised that he met people. He immediately thought that they were monsters. The young man looked around and noted that the work here was finished, and the guys breathed a sigh of joy that they remained alive. One guy told the second that the man came from the tower and that it was a real sensation. The second noted that it was impossible. The man was nearby when it began to collapse. The young people would have continued to quarrel for a long time, but suddenly, completely unexpectedly, it became dark as night. A huge monster suddenly appeared behind Li Gan, its eyes glowing red and saliva dripping from its mouth. The boys were very scared. They were covered in sweat and shouted that it was the leader of the pack. Li Gang, who was not afraid at all, calmly told the young men that they should run away. The leader of the pack began to scream very loudly. Fire burst from his mouth, and the boys clenched their teeth and grabbed their heads with their hands. After a few seconds, but to the guys it seemed like it lasted forever, it was all over. The guys were very happy that they were alive. They were very scared and could not come to their senses. They opened their eyes wide. Beads of sweat appeared on their faces. The young men looked ahead. The man who had just recently advised them to run away was standing there as if nothing had happened. Compared to the guys who were holding their heads, the man was, as before, absolutely calm. The young men looked ahead and thought that the stranger had protected them from the monster. The guy with a sly smile on his face told the dog that she was a lousy mongrel. And then, literally a few seconds later, he rose up to deal with the dog. The guy made a fist, beat the monster, and said that it was an obedient little dog. Li Gang didn't put in much effort, and after a while, the dog didn't pose any danger to them. The young people who were watching all this opened their mouths and eyes wide in shock. But the guy just smiled cheerfully. There wasn't a scratch on him, and he didn't look tired. He stood in front of the young people and looked very small against the backdrop of the huge monster. The guy told the boys that he had finished his work, brought his hand to his nose, and thought that it stunk. He said he tried not badly, and then he called the guys. They were very scared. The guy looked closely at the boys and began to say something unintelligible. They were very scared. Beads of sweat appeared on their faces from fear. They asked again what the man was saying. The young man laughed cheerfully and told the boys to buy him a lot of food. The guys looked at the young man. They certainly didn't expect such a turn of events. He was silent for a moment and said that he also needed clothes. The young men looked at the stranger in surprise. And the young people decided to fulfill the guy's request because he saved them, and they took him to a cafe. A few minutes later, he put an empty plate on the table with a loud bang. The young men took the bill that the waitress brought them and opened their eyes and mouths wide. The stranger ate $1,000 worth of food. The guy said the order was small because they said they didn't have much money. The guy told the boys that they themselves said that they could treat him to anything. This was the price for their lives, and ordered another portion of noodles. One of the young men approached the stranger and asked him who he was, a Templar or a bishop, and asked him what he was doing near the tower. The guy took a toothpick out of his mouth and said that he was inside the tower and then came out of it. This surprised the guys, and the stranger also wanted to ask something. The man noted that they looked like ordinary townspeople, but for some reason they emanated a magical aura. One of the guys replied that his partner was a Templar, and noted that the man was most likely also a Templar and had received the blessing of a sacred entity. The stranger took the spoon. He became angry and replied that he would not wag his tail in front of some entity. The young man wanted to add something else, but stopped mid-sentence when he saw his reflection. Beads of sweat appeared on his face in surprise, and his eyes narrowed to become like dots. He got up from the table and started shouting that he needed a mirror, and the waitress frightenedly pointed out where it was hanging. The guy took off his t-shirt, stood in front of a huge mirror, and began to look at himself carefully. He was surprised to note that his body was completely healed. The man even looked into his own mouth and noted that his old wounds were so terrible that they simply could not be healed. He looked at his left hand and finally realized that it was whole and fully functional. The guy began to carefully examine the pattern on his palm and could not understand what it was. He began to look closely, and after a while he saw a silhouette that looked very much like a snake. The guy grabbed his left hand with his right hand, clenched his teeth, and a system message appeared in front of him, saying that he had experienced death and accomplished an impossible feat. Lee also realized that all his skills were inherited by the new body, and the achievements would be converted into experience points. He received a divine skill. The system message also informed him that all skills and traits had been inherited and transformed, and that the power of the Ophiuchus was available to him. The young man saw Ophiuchus in front of him, touched him with his hand, and received strength from him. Literally a few minutes later, the guy found himself in a cafe and was sitting on the floor in bewilderment. The guy's face was covered in sweat from bewilderment, and his pupils became very narrow. The guys approached the stranger. One of them began to touch his hands and asked with fear if everything was okay with him. He asked the boys if they had ever imagined a huge snake, and they looked at the guy in bewilderment. One of the boys said that they hadn't seen anything like that. The man suddenly took off his clothes and ran to the mirror, and then began to scream and squeeze his wrist. The boy said that other people don't see it, and the guys thought that the longer they look at him, the weirder he acts. The guy was very surprised, because he saw in front of him a message that he had become the owner of the constellation Ophiuchus. He stood and saw in front of him a huge number of system messages and read each one carefully. The boy folded his hands in front of him and thought about how his body had changed due to the super regeneration skill. He had never heard of other saints seeing something like this. The young man thought about the fact that he did not feel the energy of sacred beings. The guy understood that no matter what, he was happy with this turn of events, because his body had fully recovered. The man thought that now he needed to track down the traitors who had left him to die, namely the bastard who had stuck a dagger in his back. He laughed and said that his body began to tremble from such thoughts. He was glad that the traitors would come to an end, and the guys who were nearby could not understand why he was behaving like that. People gathered at the place where the demon tower was and thought that it was considered indestructible, but suddenly collapsed. This news will turn the whole world upside down. One of the journalists said that this place has a connection with the hero Li Gang, and it is possible that the destruction of the tower was the work of his followers or saints who did not like him. The second journalist replied that it was all very interesting, and then told the young man to look at the one who was pulling him. The guy noted that even high-ranking saints had a hard time dealing with this monster, so who challenged him and even destroyed the tower? One of the reporters frowned, sweating, and asked if Li Gang had returned from the bathhouse alive. The guest noted that they cannot be sure of this. They can only wait until new clues appear. The journalists gathered for a press conference, asking Mr. Yang Wei to comment on the fact of the destruction of the demon tower and the return of Li Gang alive. Yang Wei, the holy sign of Aries, stood in front of the reporters with his brows furrowed, not knowing what to answer. The man paused for a moment, picked up the microphone, and said that he would not be making any comments on this issue. Yang Wei began to leave the hall, and journalists began to ask him to wait, and what it meant that he was not commenting on anything. The man and his guards quickly retreated and got into a car. He was very angry and hit the car with all his might, although it was not at fault. Yang Wei was very angry. He frowned and said through clenched teeth that all he had heard all day was Li Gang's name. He remembered the young man and wondered if he had really been alive and in that tower for 20 years. Yang Wei thought that this was impossible, because there were thousands of deadly beasts in the tower, and they were all black class. He thought that it was a miracle that they managed to escape from there, having stolen the red-eyed man's throat. There was no way Li could have survived there. Yang Wei smoked his pipe and thought that Gan's body was on the verge of death due to that big guy's deadly attacks, and he didn't even wear armor like all saints. The man frowned again and thought that if by some miracle he had managed to survive and return, then he clenched his teeth even tighter and screamed very loudly that then everything would end. Li Gang held a mobile phone in his hand. He showed the guy a certain person and said that he should start with this bastard. There was a plane at the airport. It arrived. The doors opened and a man started getting out. The guards greeted the young man joyfully. They said that they did not think that they would be able to meet one of the saints, and this was a great honor for them. Mr. Hugo Otis, a Sagittarius, straightened the collar of his shirt and looked around. He approached the guards and asked them where the Prime Minister was, and they replied that he was waiting for them in the office and that transport was ready. Hugo Otis said that it was wonderful and began to walk, and the guards began to bow to him. The guards broke out in beads of sweat, and one told the other that Otis was majestic. The men looked at Hugo Otis and thought that this is what a truly chosen man looks like. And the car set off, the driver taking the young man to the Prime Minister. The man was sitting in the car, looking out the window and thinking about something. He was absolutely calm. Literally a second later, his mood changed, and he thought about the annoying reporters. Otis couldn't believe the stories about Li Gan's return. The young man's mobile phone rang, but the caller's number was hidden. The man gritted his teeth and said that 20 years had passed since those events, but did not answer. He turned off the sound and turned his mobile phone face down. It was not his policy to pick up the phone when someone was calling. The young man calmed down a little and began to look out the window again. He began to think about something again. He remembered how he had told Li Gang many years ago that he was destined to die. Then the guy, with a smile on his face, asked if he really had such a low opinion of him. Hugo Otis remembered that when they attacked the Demon Tower, he, at Goon's request, went outside and held back the incoming hordes of monsters. He wanted to believe that his premonition was deceiving him and that Gon would manage to return alive. The boy remembered holding hands and asking other people why Gon wasn't with them. The saints who went inside were with him, abandoned Li Gan, and returned with Red-Eye's head. The whole world soon learned about this event, and the 12 saints were recognized as heroes and gained even greater influence. Hugo Otis could not believe that Gon was dead, so he asked the saints again and again to begin the search. Jean-Louis Morin, the holy sign of the dark cancer, with a sly smile, told Otis that it was enough to talk about Ghana. He noted that Hugo knew perfectly well that there were a huge number of monsters coming out of the Demon Tower, and there was no chance that Li had survived. Morin said that if Otis was so worried about him, he could go and start searching alone. No one would stop him, and noted that in that case, the list of saints would be shortened. The young man, who was very badly wounded, was in great despair. Hugo Otis straightened the collar of his shirt again, frowning at the old memories. He looked at the city streets and thought that although Gan was very strong, he could not cope with the monsters. A lot of time had passed, so he was definitely dead. The man began to remember again and again what Li Gang was like. He pressed his lips tightly. At this point, the driver informed Mr. Hugo that the Prime Minister was calling. He turned to Otis and asked if he could speak, and the man asked what was the matter. The Prime Minister asked if Hugo had heard the news and remarked that it looked like the Demon Tower had been destroyed. The guy grabbed his head, laughed to himself, and thought that this story was haunting him. He looked at his mobile and said that if the Prime Minister intended to ask him to start searching for Gon, he would have to refuse. The man said that Gon died that day and that the tower incident was most likely a setup by his fans. Otis said if the Prime Minister intended to take advantage of the situation and gain more votes, but he interrupted him and said that was not the case. The man said that if the report that had just been given to the South Korean government was true, then a call had been made to that number very recently. This information stunned Hugo, and he asked in surprise what kind of challenge they were talking about. The Prime Minister said the call was made from Li Gang's personal phone number. Hugo Otis started to beat his fists on the driver's seat and shout whether it was all true, and the driver got scared and almost got into an accident. The young man's face was covered in sweat, and he screamed at the top of his lungs for the driver to stop the car. Hugo started to get out of the car. He thought that that recent call was from Gan. The mobile phone screen showed information that 30 calls had been missed, and a voice message had been sent. The young man held a mobile phone in his hands. His pupils became narrow, and beads of sweat appeared on his face. Hugo began to dial some number, then put the phone to his ear and listened to the long beeps. After some time, someone answered on the other end of the line. His call was expected. Otis heard a voice in English tell him that it would find him and kill him. The guy was very scared. He thought that the manner of speech was very similar to the way Li Gang spoke, and he ordered the driver to turn around to the airport. Li Gang was still in the cafe looking at the phone screen and smilingly noting that the young man had grown up and dared to ignore his calls. The guys asked the young man who he was calling so persistently, and he said no one, which surprised them greatly. He looked at the phone screen and told one of the boys that he had previously called it a smartphone and noted that it was an amazing thing. Lee said that he entered the tower in 2005, and now it is 2025 and the world has become a much better place. The guys were surprised that the man was using a smartphone for the first time. They told him that he could connect to the internet and even follow the news. The man was happy because he could watch the news about Li Gan. The guys told the man that this was a very hot topic to discuss right now and showed him where to press. Li Gang and the kid who taught him how to use a smartphone opened their mouths in surprise. Li Gang carefully read the comments and began to squeeze the phone with all his might out of anger, and the guy begged him not to do it. Li shouted that the saints had not dealt with Red Eyes. They had fled as soon as they met the monster. After a few minutes, the guy calmed down and said that he would ignore this information because in some ways it was even sweet. The man continued to study the news and came across information that he had made a will and all the money was to go to orphanages. Li Gang looked at the screen and hoped that the money had reached its recipients. But the next news shocked him. He broke his phone out of anger, and the news said that he had given everything to the 12 saints, since they would manage everything for the good of the whole world. Li screamed that he would skin the pathetic gods alive, and the young man cried over his mobile phone because it had died. Gan sat over a plate of food and thought about what he should do in such a difficult situation. He thought that he intended to warn them of his return, but his appearance was now very different. No one would believe that he was Li Gang and would be perceived as a freak. The man was thinking about how he had to remain quiet for a while he tortured each of the saints, and the boy was crying over his broken cell phone. The young people were sitting at the table when Li Gang felt awkward. The man received a system message that he was being watched, and he thought it was an aura. The guy stood up and started walking somewhere. The guys asked him where he was going. He answered that he was going to get some air. The man left the cafe and began to look around. What he saw surprised him. He realized that there were avatars in front of him, and asked himself if it was an animal of the holy sign of the white Aries in front of him. The system message informed that the avatars had recreated the barrier in the name of the white ram, and they were demanding tribute from Li, and the man only gritted his teeth. Gan was very angry and said, even though they are sucking up to the sacred entities, who are they trying to command? The guy wanted to say something when he heard his name being called, and he began to listen to the conversation. The young men were talking about how everyone was talking about Li Gan, and the noise from all the chatter would soon kill him. The girl was telling her companion that this stupidity was being talked about everywhere because of the damn news. The man replied that Gan's name was not tarnished, but he was amazed at how everyone had suddenly become interested in him. The girl supported the young men who had badges with the Gemini Zodiac sign flashing on their clothes. The guys opened their mouths in surprise and thought that the people who were talking about Li were from the Gemini constellation squad. Li Gang, who heard the conversation about himself, immediately walked towards the couple. The man frowned. The guy started shouting at him to come back immediately, as they should not be provoked. Li Gang walked closer to the young people, stood in front of them and looked at the girl and the man without blinking. He frowned and asked the guy what he was staring at, then told him to get out of there. The young men who were feeding Li and standing a little further away became frightened and thought that they were finished. The man with the Zodiac sign on his sweater took a drag and exhaled nicotine smoke straight into Li Gan's face. The young man was surprised by this attitude, and he looked at the man angrily, and he began to ask what happened, some kind of problem. The man put his face right next to Li and told him that if he had a problem, he should hit him. The mustachioed man's companion told him to leave the guy alone because he was going to shit his pants. The couple left the young man alone, and the man, passing by Li, called him a coward. The man told his companion that all those who are fans of Li Gang are no different from each other, and the girl agreed with him. Li wondered why the weakest saint was so popular with everyone, and whether it was completely absurd to consider him a saint. The boy told Li that he had held up well, then noted that these people were part of the ranking representatives of the Gemini constellation. Li Gang called the damn cockroaches with all his might, and tears appeared on the face of the guy who stood next to him. The couple turned around. They repeated the word cockroach in surprise and asked if he had said that to them. Li Gang said with a sarcastic smile on his face that he called them, "They are the cockroaches." The man ran towards Li Gan, looked the boy in the eye, and told him to repeat what he said. Li gave the mustachioed man a flick on the forehead and said that he was a pathetic simpleton who didn't even have a magical aura. The guy simply raised his hand up and the man flew away from him several meters. The mustachioed man's companion, who was watching all this, began to scream very loudly. The guys who were watching all this from the side opened their mouths in surprise. The young man watched the reactions of those around him and was very pleased with himself. After some time, the mustachioed man's companion crept up to the young man. She wanted no one to notice her. Li laughed and asked her if she seriously expected him not to notice her sneaking up. And while she was in a stupor, he also gave her such a flick that she also flew back several meters. Li Gang looked at the young people and calmly said that they were losers. The young men told Li that using magic in the middle of the street was strictly prohibited. He got angry and said that the guy was saying something wrong, because if he had used magic, there would have been nothing left of those two. The boys opened their mouths in surprise and thought that the man had knocked out two high-ranking Templars with just brute force. A few minutes later, Li Gang sat down next to the mustachioed fat man and began to look at him. The young man saw a pendant on the stranger's neck and began to examine it closely. Then he took the medallion in his hand and pulled it with all his might, so much so that the thread on which it was hanging broke. Li held the medallion between two fingers and said that's what he felt when he hit it, and noted that it was a relic. Gan looked at the relic and thought about where weaklings could get hold of a relic, because only saints should have them. One of the boys approached him and asked if it was true that he didn't know anything. He said that several decades ago, humanity was practically wiped off the face of the earth, but thanks to sacred beings and chosen constellations, the disaster was survived. 12 people could not protect the entire vast world, and the saints began to gather followers, calling themselves the Branchings. Those who were given a piece of the power of the saints began to be called Templars. They were divided into ranks. Faith is the source of strength for the Templars, and the chosen ones receive relics from sacred entities. The guy continued to hold the medallion in his hands and thought that a lot had changed in 20 years. Li was distracted from his thoughts by a guy who pointed his finger to the side, and the young man looked at him questioningly. The young man saw before him again the avatars of wealth and greed who were enjoying the current situation. Li read the system message that the avatars demanded that he deal with the attackers. They were thirsty for bloodshed and promised a worthy reward. Beads of sweat appeared on the guy's face. He thought that this was not it, because Li had attracted the attention of the avatars. They are like reflections of the sacred beings themselves, and standing in their way is like challenging the gods. The guy started telling Li to hurry up and do as they asked, but he just laughed. Li said that he thought that where the stinking aura of Aries was coming from, it turns out that they intended to fill their bellies. Gan came to the conclusion that in the end, nothing had changed, and he kicked the asphalt with all his might. A very strong wind arose. The young people could hardly stand on their feet. They could not understand what was happening. One of the guys looked at everything that was happening with surprise, and beads of sweat appeared on his face from fear. Li put his hands on his hips and said that they were showing off despite the fact that they were worthless losers. The boys looked up and noticed that the white Aries constellation had retreated and the barrier had also disappeared. One of the boys had beads of sweat on his face, and he thought that this was not an easy person to deal with. The guy was surprised when the young man called him by name, thereby distracting him from his thoughts. Li asked the guy if those cheeky idiots really belonged to the Gemini branch. He replied that in their country the Gemini branch had the greatest influence. The elite group had gathered 2/3 of all large corporations. Li Gang asked the guy so they should have money on them, and he looked at him in surprise. The man smiled and asked the boy that the clothes they wear should be branded. He started to rip off his clothes, saying that it was time to make some good money, and the guys watched everything that was happening. In the evening, the young people stood near the building, and Li said that they were finally there and noted that the day had been very long. One of the guys showed with his hand which apartment he lives in, and his friend noted that his door was next door. The guys thanked the young man for saving their lives and even walking them home. Li began to yawn and began to ask whether they were going inside or not. Since he really wanted to sleep, the guys were very surprised. After he found himself in the apartment, he very quickly took off his clothes, got a haircut, and stood in front of the mirror. The young man began to admire himself and smiled at his reflection in the mirror. He liked it very much. The guy saw all this and told the man that a short haircut suits him very well. He said that Li now looks much cooler, and he was not prepared for such admiration. The man thought that in the past, baldness was a side effect of using his abilities, and now he tidied up his hair. Li Gang frowned and his smile turned into disgust. He couldn't understand why this happened. He looked at the huge fly and wondered what the fly had forgotten in their apartment. Literally a few seconds later, he caught the hand in a fist and squeezed it very tightly. Li opened his hand and threw away the remains, and the boy raised 2 fingers up and was surprised that he caught the fly with one hand, because even experts can't do it. The man began to catch one after another the luring one and asked what number it was and why they were sticking to him, and the guy noticed that his scent attracted monsters. Lee told them to smell his ass and said that this usually happens because something is wrong with the house. He looked at the shelf and said that the guy keeps nasty things in the house, which is why the creatures flock here. The boy looked at the figurines and noted that this could not be an abomination, since they were received from the constellation Gemini. The guy took the statuette in his hand and said that these artifacts did not belong to him, but they were blessed by the saint. But he did not finish speaking because Lee broke it. The young man looked at his hand, covered his nose, and said it was disgusting, and the guy started shaking over the broken figurine. The man picked up the mask and told the guy that it was intended to spy on the buyer. He started throwing things off the shelf, threw out the music box because it collects personal information, and the watch attracts the attention of monsters. The boy screamed from injustice. Li Gang said that the saints had appropriated his property and then started selling such disgusting goods to people. The guy got really angry and said that the very thought of such injustice made him furious. The young man who stood in front of the door heard someone shouting that all this junk needed to be thrown out. Li Gang was holding some object in his hands, and the guy was holding him by the shirt and crying really hard. The young man entered the apartment and saw all this, looking at the guys in surprise. Lee looked at the stranger and asked who he was, and the boy was very happy. He was very happy to see Songjae and called him by name, who confirmed that it was him. Sun frowned, his face became displeased, and he noted that he was the owner of this apartment. By this time, Li Gang had managed to beat and smash a lot of objects. He didn't know what to answer. In the branch of the White Aries, in the residence of Yang Wei, a very interesting conversation was taking place in raised tones. The man frowned deeply. Beads of sweat appeared on his face from worry, and he asked if the Korean avatars had really disappeared. The young man who knelt before him said that it was true, and noted that there was a lot of fuss about it. Yang Wei frowned, gritted his teeth, and began to think about who could do such a thing. He knew very well that avatars were direct representatives of sacred entities, and only someone extremely strong could disperse them. Yang Wei ordered the man to contact the other saints and ask if they had anything to do with this. The man replied that he understood the order, and noted that Strelitz had not been in touch for a long time. Jan replied that this was no cause for concern, since he wanted to get a new position. The young man replied that Hugo immediately boarded another flight after arriving at the airport. Jan listened to the young man and was very surprised, then asked where the man was heading. The guy said that the destination was South Korea. This information surprised Jan very much. He stood up from his seat and began to scratch his beard and think about something. For some time he silently digested the information. Yang Wei thought that Hugo had always been on good terms with Li Gang. The man frowned and wondered if such actions could be related to the return of that bastard Gan. It was very surprising, but Yang Wei began to wonder if Li Gang had actually survived. He grabbed some statue and threw it down the steps with all his might. It almost hit the man who came to report. Jan started yelling at the guy to report clearly. He was very angry. The man began to talk about how a Templar of the Gemini branch was found in the place where all the avatars disappeared. He was unconscious. The guy told Jan that a man was lying in the middle of the street in his underwear. Witnesses said that before this, he had gotten into a fight with a very handsome young man. A candlestick with candles fell to the floor, and Wei noted that it couldn't be Li Gang, since his face was covered in scars. Yang thought that things weren't going too well, although it was entirely possible that Li had managed to survive and return. Wei thought that the avatars disappeared for some unknown reason, and the worst thing was that they failed to finish off the Spider Queen. The man clenched his fist and thought that at this rate his position could be in jeopardy. He told the man to have a plane prepared for him, and the assistant asked if Wei was going to go there personally. Jan scratched his beard again and replied that he wanted to see everything with his own eyes. The man very quickly put on his coat, took a cigar, frowned, and noted that something devilish was happening there. In Korea, in the Gemini Branch Hospital, a fat man was lying on a bed. Various devices were connected to his body. He also could not breathe on his own. An oxygen mask was connected. A gray-haired elderly man entered the boy's room. He frowned very deeply and clenched his teeth. He pointed his hand at the guy and began to scream furiously, asking who dared to hurt his grandson so badly. The old man started pointing his fingers at some man, who calmly asked the old man not to worry so much. The man told the old man that this was exactly why the twins had sent him here. The red-haired boy frowned and asked his youth if they really met at the Demon Tower. The guy was wondering if it was true that the man was able to kill all the draggers with his bare hands and knock out a rank Templar, and the young man noted that everything was so. The redhead screamed that it was all a lie, and that the man had destroyed all of his relics, and Lee noted that they were all fake. The guy gritted his teeth and asked what branch the man was from, and the guy laughed and asked if he thought he needed something like that. The red-haired man closed his eyes and asked what about the god he was loyal to. Lee replied that he didn't need 12 idiots for nothing. The guy started asking Lee about his rank, and he said that he was a production worker. Then he asked what the man's name was. The young man's pupils became like dots, and he calmly said that his name was Lee Gang. The boys who were in the apartment started talking about something and interrupting each other, and Lee looked at all this with bewilderment. The red-haired boy told Gan that he broke into someone else's house without permission and destroyed all the relics, and then he shouted furiously that the young man dared to pretend to be the great Lee Gan. Songjae started doing such things that the boy started yelling at him that he was a crazy bastard. A system message appeared in front of Lee that a burst of magic from a Gemini follower had been detected, and he noticed that the red-haired man wanted to destroy the house. Lee Gang was also able to study the guy's rank and other characteristics using system messages. The young man thought that the guy at such a young age already possessed high-ranking skills, and the genius trait was not given to him for the sake of a sounding point. The boy broke out in sweat and started yelling at the man to run away, as Song was a rank Templar and a crazy fan of Lee Gang. Zay asked Jiming if he was crazy, and then told him to get lost if he didn't want to get killed. The red-haired man was very angry and noticed that by playing with fire so furiously, the boy risked wetting his pants. Li Gan got tired of watching everything that was happening and decided to use force. Sun fell to the floor, and Gan said that at this rate the guy could not only burn down his apartment, but the whole house. The boy asked the young man if Sun had died, as he was very worried, and he replied that everything was fine. Then Li Gang added that everything was probably fine, and the guy burst into tears. He looked at Z and saw that he was shaking, foaming at the mouth, and a huge bump had appeared on his forehead. Lee began to yawn, said that he was going to bed, since he needed to come to his senses, and the guy shook Z and asked him if he was alive. Gan opened the door to the room, and what he saw shocked the young man. Everywhere in the room, on every shelf, there were figurines and statues of Li Gan. There were a lot of them. Lee asked what it was, and the guy said that Sung Jae was an ardent fan of Lee Gang. The red-haired man asked the man to be careful with the figurines, because this collection was dear to him. Gan said that they were really annoying him, and that their heads needed to be twisted off, which he started doing, and Sun started screaming like a madman. Z called the guy a psycho and asked him to stop. He replied that he was Lee Gang, and not a psycho, as Song had called him earlier. The red-haired guy was not prepared for the man to destroy his collection. Snot and tears mixed on his face. On TV, in the news, they said that yesterday, a representative of the Gemini branch was attacked. The identity of the attacker is not established, but he stole personal belongings. Hugh grabbed his head and thought that this was definitely Li Gan's doing. He was surprised at what he was thinking, and this was the first news he had heard about him. A waitress approached the guy and asked if he was ready to order. The man told Yang Wei to shut up this clown show and get out of here. He was very angry. He said with a sly smile on his face that it was all uninteresting, because Hugh had figured him out very quickly. Yang Wei began to laugh like a madman, and then said that they had not seen each other for a long time, and he had not been able to contact Hugh for a long time. Yang told the man that upon his hasty arrival in Korea, he most likely came here because of Lee Gang, and told Hugh to tell him everything he knew. The blonde man replied that he hated Ian because he was a pervert who stole bodies from other people. The waitress froze in place. She stared at the man. Beads of sweat appeared on her face. The girl became nervous. She was very nervous and asked the man what she was doing. Hugh slammed his fist on the table, gritted his teeth, and thought that Ian was an idiot with idiotic jokes, and he needed to get to Gan faster than anyone else. The guys were in a supermarket. The boy asked Sun if it really was Lee Gang, and he replied that the stranger looked completely different. The redhead noted that Lee is a hero who saved humanity, and he would not act like a thug. The guy told Sun that he saw a man coming out of the demon tower, and that his strength was colossal. But the red-haired man was stubborn as a ram. Z said that he was confident in his words. Since his father told him so, the boy wanted to say something, but Song interrupted him. The young people went to the checkout when they heard someone shouting that there was a thief in the store. He ran so fast that he swept everything in his path. Everyone in the store was scared. The guy noted that the thief had high speed and was most likely from the Scorpio branch, and Sun noted that he was using his powers to rob the store. It turned out that the thief had stolen not only valuable goods from the store, but also wallets from visitors. He had to be stopped, since there would definitely be nothing left there. And the thief smiled sarcastically and thought that the surrounding pathetic idiots and even the Templars were not able to keep up with him. The thief realized that he had made a good profit. He had a wonderful catch and decided that it was time to get out. But he didn't succeed. Completely unexpectedly, he was intercepted by some hero. The thief was definitely not prepared for such a turn of events. He was very nervous, and sweat, tears, and saliva were mixed on his face. It was Li Gang who caught the thief, and the guy he was staying with asked what the man was doing there, and he replied that he forgot to tell the guys to buy chicken. The stranger told Gan that he was quite good, because it was quite difficult to catch the Templars of the Scorpio constellation, given their agility. The man told Li that judging by his aura, he was an ordinary follower and advised him to report the incident to the police next time. Gan came closer to the young man, began to examine him, and thought about who he was. The guy wanted to ask the man something, but something distracted him and he began to look around. There were a lot of people in the store. They were all very scared. The thief, who was lying on the floor, realized that an earthquake had started and decided that he needed to get out, because this was his chance. He didn't think about anything else, but like a bullet, he began to run out of the store. Everyone looked at him in surprise. There was a smile on the thief's face. He thought that because of that man he would be caught, but the earthquake played into his hands. But the thief didn't have time to run far. The floor covering in front of him began to come apart, and what he saw shocked the man. The misfortune bringer appeared in front of him. The thief was very surprised that the monster appeared in the green zone. He stood and thought that he needed to run as far away as possible before it was too late. The thief began to run away again and thought that this creature, although very strong, would not be able to catch him. But how wrong the young man was. He ran straight into the monster's mouth with a smile on his face. And the people who were in the store watched everything that was happening without taking their eyes off it. The monster continued to stand in place, looking with interest at the people who had gathered in a crowd. Some onlookers were even filming the monster on their mobile phones, when a message was heard that an emergency had arisen and the building needed to be evacuated. They also announced over the loudspeaker that the Spider Queen was on the territory of the hypermarket and had started attacking people. People ran in all directions, and over the loudspeaker they said that the Spider Queen had appeared on the territory. The little boy did not react to the message in any way. He was lost and crying loudly, and the monster was approaching him. Li Gang hit the monster with all his might just when it opened its mouth a few centimeters away from the child. Gan told the boy that he should be careful. The child had tears in his eyes and was shaking with horror. Li. He extended his hand to the boy and calmly asked him if the baby was scared. The child didn't say anything to the man, but just started running away very quickly. Li looked at all this with bewilderment. The guy coughed into his fist and said that most likely the boy was okay. Li Gang was surprised and asked what the hell this giant was doing here. And then he added with a smile that for the first time in a long time he would be able to have some fun. Yang Wei was driving a car and asked his driver to repeat what he had said. He replied that the misfortune bringers had appeared in the middle of a hypermarket in Pucheng City, and Wei asked the driver to tell him the name of the creature. He said that the monster's name was the Spider Queen, and this information made Jan very angry. Wei thought about how they had failed during the last raid, and he had barely managed to put the seal on it while she had managed to escape. He clenched his fist and thought about how he wouldn't be able to hold back the red-class monster on his own. After the appearance of the attractors, people began to divide locations into 6 classes according to the level of danger. The blue zone is a blessed abode. The green zone was also considered safe, and there was no need to be afraid of anyone there. But in the yellow zone, it was necessary to be on guard, as it belonged to the category of light danger. The orange zone was best avoided because it already posed a major threat to life. The red zone included locations that were simply teeming with deadly monsters. But in the black zone, life is completely impossible. There are a huge number of monsters there. The Spider Queen appeared in the hypermarket, which means that this area is now considered a red zone. The driver approached Yang Wei with a question about what to do about the situation in the hypermarket. The man thought about something for a few minutes, and then replied that they needed to seal everything. Jan clenched his fist and thought that no one should know about the incident because their failure on the last raid was to blame for everything. The man told the driver to pass on the message that those inside the supermarket could not be saved, and that the Templars needed to be sent to seal the building. Meanwhile, the number of insects in the supermarket increased. They crawled around the premises in search of food. The man tried to shield himself from the monsters with his hands, his brows furrowed in confusion. He began to use his powers, his face twisted in pain, and he began to call the insects names. A few minutes later, he used a special skill and froze the insects, rendering them immobile. Beads of sweat appeared on the young man's face, and he began to say something with a smile. But the insects were not frozen and immobilized for very long. They quickly overcame the ice freeze. The man's joy quickly turned to anger. He couldn't understand how the monsters were able to destroy his spell so quickly. A few minutes later, Li Gang appeared in front of him and told the man to step aside. The guy, with beads of sweat appearing on his face, wondered when the guy had managed to get to this place so quickly. Li began throwing the cans aside and said that the parasites were so hungry that they decided to feast on people. The young man began throwing tin cans of drink at the insects and said that it would be better for them to eat them. The monsters didn't like all this. They opened their mouths, hissed, roared, and sprayed saliva in all directions. But Li Gang didn't think for very long. He took out a knife, and with the words, "Who is the monster opening its mouth at?" dealt with the big monster. The man was very belligerent. He gritted his teeth and said that the pathetic mobs should know their place. The guys Li Gang was staying with looked at everything that was happening with surprise, their mouths wide open. And a system message appeared in front of the young man, saying that he had destroyed the bringers of misfortune. The guy was very surprised. He read a message that his experience was increased, and he received consumables. He read that he needed to collect materials, and he would be able to create new relics and skills. The guy realized that production skills had also changed. The young man held the stone in his hands and thought that moving didn't seem so difficult to him. Perhaps he would already be able to use more energy. The guy who tried to freeze the monsters looked at Li in surprise, because he easily destroyed them. Gan approached the guys, who opened their mouths in surprise. They couldn't understand when the man had managed to deal with the monsters. The blond, short-haired boy looked at Li and wondered where he came from. Beads of sweat appeared on the man's face. He frowned and realized that he had not heard the question. Li Gang looked at him and called the stranger an uninitiated minister of the church. The man began to shout that he knew something was fishy there and noted that Li was the same man who had attacked their followers. Li Gang immediately understood that the young man was talking about that man and woman, and so he smiled slightly. The guy's mood changed literally in a second, and he punched the stranger in the face. He fell to the floor, clutching his face with his hand, and Li asked how he knew that, and then added that he knew too much. The man folded his hands into fists. Beads of sweat appeared on his face and asked how he could not recognize him. And then he added that Li had put on the clothes and badge of a beaten man. The man said that the badge was a relic that was only given to the Templars of the Gemini branch. He yelled that the secret of Li's strength was that he carried a badge, and Gan looked at the badge in surprise and asked why he had that thing on him. The man looked at the badge. His pupils became like dots and said that it was an abomination. The gray-haired man began to scream very loudly. His face was covered in beads of sweat. He called Li all sorts of names. Chan said that this relic was good enough as a declaration, and that the guys had most likely been cheated big time, adding that those bastards hadn't changed a bit in 20 years. He wanted to say something else, but a monster to the side began to scream very loudly. Li Gang stood there, his face completely devoid of any emotion. He was calm. The guys were very scared. Beads of sweat appeared on their faces. They were shaking with fear. The Spider Queen was very angry. She followed the people, and they ran away from her in different directions. The gray-haired man turned his head to the side and stuttered that the Spider Queen was coming towards them. Li Gang looked in her direction and realized that he needed to act quickly. Everyone was running away from the Spider Queen, but the guy flew straight to her and even called her a spider. The young man began to hit the monster with his fists and shouted with hatred for it to get out of here. The Spider Queen didn't like the guy's familiarity at all, and she began to destroy everything in her path. People looked at everything that was happening with horror. They were all very scared. The guys Li Gang lived with opened their mouths in surprise. Beads of sweat appeared on their faces. The gray-haired man also looked at everything that was happening with horror. He frowned. The guy thought about the fact that Li rushed at the monster without any relic on him. Those present in the supermarket heard a message telling the Gemini branch Templars to be careful. The boys immediately realized that it was the voice of the Gemini branch bishop's son Hek. One of the boys thought about telepathy. The man said it was Sun Hyuk, and he called out to Sun Jae and Sun Jun to leave the building immediately. The bishop stated that the people from the Aries branch intend to completely seal the building. The man said that Yang Wei himself was heading here, and that he couldn't be stopped, and that even a saint couldn't handle the Spider Queen. That's why they decided to get rid of the place completely, because the saints would have problems if people found out about their failure. The white-haired man asked Song Jun if he had a teleportation skill. He told the guy to take Song Jae and get out of there. The boys were very upset by the fact that only the two of them could be saved. There was panic in the supermarket. People were very worried. Others were helping the weaker ones. The insects were crawling out of every crack. They were very angry and had no intention of retreating anywhere. But Li Gang did not stand still. He gradually approached the Spider Queen. He was not afraid of her at all. The gray-haired man watched everything that was happening with a frown. Beads of sweat appeared on his face, and he was shaking with fear. The bishop began to answer the guy's question about whether the two of them should teleport, and the man asked if there were any problems. The gray-haired man said with a smile on his face that they had no problems. The red-haired guy shouted that the man was carrying it, because there was clearly not enough help from outside, and didn't he understand how badly they were stuck. The guy shouted at the man, asking if he was suggesting leaving all these people here to die, but he reacted to the crit very calmly. He calmly told the guy to think for himself about the fact that the Spider Queen could appear in the middle of the city. What would people think then? The red-haired boy was surprised, and the man said that the townspeople would reproach the branches of the constellations. Their faith would weaken, and their strength would waver. Then he added that he could take one person with him. Song Jae would go with him. He was ordered to get him out of here. The red-haired man shouted that his friend was here and he couldn't leave him, and that there were still a lot of people in the supermarket who hadn't managed to evacuate. The man gritted his teeth and replied that the guy was an idiot and now was not the time for whims. He said he had no desire to die here because of an incompetent person like him. The man replied that he could not go against the orders of his elders, so he would finish off all the extra cargo so that the guy would have no choice. The red-haired guy clenched his fists and started yelling at the man that he was a crazy bastard. And he began to laugh. He asked Song Jae if he was going to fight him. He noted that they were on completely different levels. The man told Sun to check his conscience and make a reasonable decision. The man wanted to say something else to the young man, but he stopped mid-word. Song Jae didn't think for long, but used his strength and the man flew to the side. Li Gang ran into the hypermarket and asked in surprise why the guys were still there. The boy noted that it was very dangerous to be in the hypermarket, so he should move his buns. The guys were very happy to see the young man, and the red-haired one noted that the attractors had blocked the exit and they couldn't get out of here. The dream said that they have two ways out of here. The first is to take the teleport to the gray-haired man. The second way out is much more difficult and consists of destroying all these creatures. The guy said that there were a lot of wounded people in the hypermarket and they needed help. And then he added that the people from the Aries branch decided to seal the entire building, thereby not giving anyone a chance. Li Gang frowned and said that this was indeed a huge problem, but the gray-haired man only wheezed. A few minutes later, he stood up and began cursing Li with all his might and calling him to come to him. Gan calmly said that it seemed to him that the man had chickened out and had already run away with his heels flashing, and the gray-haired man yelled at him to shut his mouth. He looked at his mobile phone and said angrily that he would see if they could get out of here alive, and he would be able to escape alone. The gray-haired man frowned. Beads of sweat ran down his face. He was thinking about something. He didn't notice how the Spider Queen approached him and entangled him in her webs. After a few seconds, the gray-haired man realized what was happening and began to panic. He was definitely not prepared for such a development of events. But the Spider Queen did not stand on ceremony for very long. She lifted the man up in order to profit from him. The boys opened their mouths in surprise. Their pupils narrowed very much, and beads of sweat appeared on their faces. They were brought out of their stupor by Li's voice. He told the boys to take care of the wounded, and he would sort everything out. Then, when he was done, he would join them. The guys were very surprised, and Gan calmly said that it wouldn't take much time. Yang Wei arrived at the hypermarket and immediately asked about the situation. He was told that the building was already practically sealed and cordoned off. Jan said that given the fact that the work had begun before his arrival, everything was progressing very slowly. The guys began to wonder why the defense wasn't holding as it should. The second one noted that he felt like something was about to break out. A group of people standing near the supermarket began to cough very heavily because smoke was coming from the building. Those around saw a huge snake with its mouth wide open and its eyes glowing red. Yang Wei was very surprised. He frowned and seemed completely unprepared to see the snake. People started running out of the hypermarket. They were screaming to be saved and that there were people in the middle of the building. They started telling stories about some guy in a hypermarket who was fighting monsters alone. Yang Wei, who stood to the side, thought that people were talking nonsense because no one would fight monsters alone, especially since he was also not able to do it. He told the security that he would see it all with his own eyes. The security got nervous, and the guys told Jan that it could be very dangerous. Wei said he didn't care, then added that everyone should be ready and went inside the hypermarket. The man walked into the middle of the building and what he saw shocked him. In front of him was the Spider Queen. A few seconds later, he realized that she was killed and wondered who could have done this. Jan walked around the hypermarket and thought about the fact that there were traces of a real massacre in the premises. He was wondering what the hell had happened here. Wei thought that someone was specifically hunting the Spider Queen, and then said that he got rid of his headache because he already had enough problems. The man stopped. Beads of sweat appeared on his face. He began to understand that he felt a familiar energy. Jan went out onto the balcony and began to look down. He was interested in what was going on there. Wei saw Hugo Otis and was curious about what the young man was doing there. Ian began to think that this could be Hugo's doing. He thought that it made sense. Wei frowned deeply, clenched his teeth, and thought about how Otis missed him. Then the man was distracted by a question. Someone from behind asked Jan what was wrong, the pig, and he got really scared. Lee asked Wei if everything was okay, and then noted that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. And what happened to his expression? Jan was covered in beads of sweat and began to scream like crazy. He was gasping for air and choking. At this time, rescuers were working near the entrance to the hypermarket, helping the wounded. The guys Li Gang lived with were seated aside and given warm blankets. The boy was coughing and Song was deep in thought. The red-haired man was wondering if that guy could really be Li Gang, as he said, although he looks different, his movement said otherwise. Then the young man was distracted from his thoughts by someone's voice. It was very familiar. Someone was calling the guy by name. It was Hugo Otis. He asked Song Jae what he was doing near the hypermarket. Sun asked the man why he had returned. The boy was surprised to see the holy sign of Sagittarius, and Hugo got angry, since this is not the way to greet one's own father. The dark-haired guy started laughing, and Song gritted his teeth and became very angry. Hugo noted that his son was unharmed, and noted that a little medical attention would quickly get him back in action. He told his son that he had been informed that the monsters inside the building had been destroyed, and asked if he had seen who had done it. Sun said something inarticulate, and Otis smiled and wondered who his son was like. The guy asked Sun if everything would be okay with Li Gang. Hugo, who heard the conversation, was very surprised. He ran up to the boy, grabbed him by the shoulders, and started shaking him, while Sun watched everything that was happening in surprise. Otis shouted what name the boy had called, began to ask where Lee was now and whether he knew him. The child was very scared. The boy asked if by mentioning the name Theksu he meant St. Hugo Otis. Then the guy said that the young man was in the supermarket, and he managed to defeat the Spider Queen, and he also introduced himself as Li Gang. The man listened to the boy very carefully. He continued to hold him by the shoulders and asked him to describe everything in more detail. Suddenly, a loud explosion was heard from the hypermarket, and people began to look in its direction. The explosion destroyed part of the hypermarket, and someone's laughter could be heard from the side. Yang Wei was making his way somewhere. He was covered in dust and dirt. There was sweat on his face, and he was trying to catch his breath. Li Gang appeared in front of the man and calmly said that this was all too much. Li told Yan that they hadn't seen each other for 20 years, and the first thing he did was just pick him up and attack him. Jan was sweating profusely and began asking how Gan had managed to stay alive and was surprised at his own question. Wei thought that the guy looked very much like Li Gang, but he didn't have a scar on his face. His voice seemed familiar, but different from before. Yang also thought that Li looked too young, and called the man names and said that he was imitating Gan, adding that he was momentarily worried. Wei looked at the young man in surprise and could not understand who was imitating whom. Jan started yelling that the guy dared to deceive him, such a great man, and said that he would pay for it with his life. Li punched Wei in the stomach and asked him what he was talking about. adding that he had always made money by deceiving others. Gan was so angry that he used his abilities, and Yang flew back several meters. A few seconds later, Wei fell onto the construction debris and began to groan in pain, and Gan looked at him calmly. Li said that each of them needed to be taught a lesson, and then asked how he had lived while he was imprisoned in the demon tower. The guy continued. He said that they had appropriated his relics and wealth and even forged his will. Yan wanted to say something, but Li, with a smile on his face, told him not to worry and noted that in any case he was going to finish them all off. Gan said that it was worth starting with the treasury and then destroying Yan's house, its branches and relics and everything else. Yang Wei, who had been listening very carefully to his opponent, screamed very loudly in horror. He gritted his teeth and thought that this definitely couldn't be happening. The man was very surprised. Yan understood that the manner of speech and behavior were definitely Li's, and the guy was definitely not bluffing, but he couldn't even recognize all his movements. Wei began to understand that it was indeed Li Gang in front of him, but how did he manage to survive and return from the demon tower? Yan thought this was nonsense and said that if it was really Li Gang in front of him, then he had to prove it. The boy looked at Yan, who had risen up and was reading the message that the sacred essence of the Aries constellation, the Jade Emperor, had revealed itself. Li laughed and said that even the sacred entity had graced him with its attention. Yang Wei was not going to leave things as they were. He began to use his special skills. Literally within a few seconds, the young man's entire body was wrapped in chains, and Wei, with a sly smile on his face, asked Li if he still considered them weaklings. He said that he didn't know how Gan survived in that tower, and began to use the sovereign skill and heavenly weapon. Li Gang watched all this calmly, and then calmly said that he was impressed by the Emperor's strength. Yang Wei gritted his teeth and angrily told the guy to quickly shut his mouth. He began to send a huge number of swords towards Li Gan, and said that it was time for him to die. In just a few minutes, the young man was completely covered in swords. Yang Wei looked at the huge mountain with his brows furrowed, and thought that he had succeeded. He started walking towards the mountain with swords, and said that it was amazing that Li was able to get out of the tower, but his self-confidence had not gone away. Jan said that challenging someone who had gained experience all these years through his followers was at the very least reckless. Wei began to smile sarcastically, and asked if it was true that Gan thought that they had been standing still for all these 20 years. Then the mountain of swords began to crumble in different directions, as if someone was taking the swords apart. Yang Wei was very scared. Beads of sweat appeared on his face. His pupils narrowed very much, and he thought that this could not be. Li finally got out of the difficult trap and punched Yan right in the face with all his might. He flew several meters and fell onto some debris from building materials. Yang was shaking with fear and thought about how Li got out of there alive and asked if it was true that it was Li Gang in front of him. The young man put his foot on Jan's stomach and noted with joy that he finally recognized him. Wei wheezed in pain, and Gan said that he came for their souls, and then added that they should prepare for the worst. Li covered his nose with his hand and told his opponent that his weapons smelled strongly of shit. Yang Wei looked at Li and thought that this level of regeneration was impossible even for the Aquarius constellation, which possessed healing skills. System messages appeared in front of Li, and he told Yan that thanks to him, he became even stronger. He leaned down in front of Wei and asked him why they didn't try out his new skill. Yan started shouting for Li to stop. System messages appeared in front of him and he turned red. Wei was very surprised when his divine essence hurriedly left while shouting curses. Yan started screaming about why the sacred entity had left him, and Li noted with a smile on his face that it had left before it was all over. Gan said that he was quite merciful, so Wei would only feel the pain that he himself had experienced. At this time, security guards Yang Wei and Hugo Otis entered the hypermarket. The security guard looked around and asked in surprise what had happened in the supermarket. There was a huge number of monsters lying on the floor of the hypermarket, which no longer posed any danger. Hugo Otis stood to the side and looked at the monsters. He thought about something for a while. Something alerted the guy. Beads of sweat appeared on his face, and he realized that the energy that was floating in the room was very familiar to him. A few minutes later, he saw someone lying in the distance and began to guess that it was Yang Wei. Hugo realized that this was Li Gang's doing, since he was always causing trouble, and the guards were saying that something was wrong here, since Yang Wei's energy was coming from below. One of the guards noted that Jan's aura was very weak, and the second began to suspect something. Hugo Otis came closer and asked the guys if they could step back a little. He began to use his powers. A few seconds later, the man jumped into the crater where Yang Wei's body lay. What Hugo saw shocked him. He immediately realized that this was definitely the work of Li Gan. Yang Wei was foaming at the mouth, and there was a note on his body indicating that he had gone to the pigsty. Hugo wondered what kind of trouble he would cause this time. The young man stood in front of a huge, pompous building and hummed a cheerful melody. Li Gang said that it was now clear where the man kept his stolen relics. He entered the building, began to look around, and said that this guy seemed to be trying to make himself out to be a god of treasures. Too much show. The young man looked to the side and thought that he could smell his relics coming from that side. He came closer to them and realized that they were all fakes. The clothes were taken from his house, but the weapons were clearly fake. What the guy saw left him in a state of great shock, and he could only sigh. There was a toothpick lying on the red velvet pillow, and on the card was an inscription stating that it had been used by Li Gang. The guy put his hands on the glass cube and said that his baby had finally been found. The people who were in this museum began to look at the strange young man in shock. A few minutes later, the alarm started to sound, and the light started to glow red. The guards started running and broadcasting information on the radio that they had a robber, and that all the guards needed to head to Sector B. Li Gang stood next to the broken cube. There were shards of glass on the floor. He was holding a toothpick in his hands. The young man was surrounded by a huge number of guards, who shouted at him to slowly put the object down and surrender. Li Gang continued to hold the toothpick in his hand and said that he didn't want to do it. The man smiled, used his special power, and simply waved the toothpick up and down. Something incredible began to happen to the guards, as if they were being lifted by an unprecedented force. Li laughed and said that old familiar things are the best and looked at the toothpick. A system message appeared in front of the guy saying that he had discovered a relic. From the system message, the guy learned that the toothpick had turned into a lump of slime and he could give it his trait. The lump smiled, and the guy, also smiling, asked him if they should go to the exit. The guy took a few steps and saw the doors. A system message appeared in front of him that he felt a strong aura of the relic of the constellation Aries. Li Gan's eyes lit up and he said that he felt a bit sorry to leave here empty-handed. The young man put his hand on the door handle and said that it was an exciting moment to receive the award. Hugo Otis was very scared. There were beads of sweat on his face. He asked if he was accidentally late. People started running out of the building, shouting something unintelligible, and Hugo watched everything that was happening. People were shouting that there were explosions all over the building and that everyone should run away, and the man folded his fists and started saying something to Gan. Li, dragging a huge bag behind him, patted his stomach and said that he was a bit hungry. Hugo Otis wrinkled his forehead. Beads of sweat appeared on his face, and he called out to Li Gan very loudly. He was very surprised, as he was not prepared to see Thexu here, as he called Hugo. The man started running towards the building with tears in his eyes, shouting that he was a bastard. Li Gang just laughed loudly and said that he did everything for the sake of old friendship. Hugo grabbed the guy who came out of the building with Li and told him that if he was alive, then he should have found him, but he was doing God knows what. The man asked if everything was okay with his leg and noticed that there was no aura coming from him, and asked where he had been all this time. And Li looked at this with surprise. He kicked Hugo in the face and asked how he could not recognize a face and called the man names. Otis sat on the ground, and Li asked the man if he wanted to die and wondered how he dared to confuse him with anyone else. The man held his face and looked in surprise at the young man standing in front of him. Hugo saw a clot of mucus on the boy's shoulder and asked if it was all true. Li began to laugh heartily and said that Taixu needed another beating. The man very quickly got up from the ground and threw himself on the guy's neck, but Gan didn't like all this very much. Otis was crying and began to ask Li if he was alive. He was wondering if it was really Gan in front of him. He hung in the young man's arms and sobbed bitterly, his face turned blue, all of which Li did not like very much. The guy threw him off and asked how he dared to rush at him so suddenly, adding that it was disgusting. Hugo replied that it was indeed Li in front of him, and a system message appeared in front of Gan, stating that the essence of the Sagittarius constellation had manifested itself. The guy looked at the essence of the Sagittarius constellation in surprise. Beads of sweat appeared on his face. Hugo was scared. He frowned and didn't understand what was happening, but Li was calm. The men looked at the essence of the Sagittarius constellation and thought about why it appeared. Li began to think about what had happened when a message appeared in front of him that the sacred entity Apollo was doubting the truth of Gan's survival. There was also a message that Apollo was offering to verify this. Otis asked how to do this. Gan read that Apollo was aiming his arrow at Li Gan and would say that everything would become clear when he shot him. The guy wanted to get rid of the god. Li was surprised that the entity, upon meeting a person, immediately pointed a weapon at him, and Hugo calmed him down, saying that everything was fine, and Apollo did not want to offend him. Gan clarified that everything was indeed fine, and then said that they should continue where they started. The man immediately remembered the phrase about Li saying that he would finish him off, and then adding that they would see each other soon. Li said that when he returned from the Demon Tower to find his house sold, his property stolen, and his relics gone, Hugo began to stutter. Gan made a fist and told the man to let him hit him just once. Without receiving an answer, Li hit Hugo, who, with a smile on his face and tears in his eyes, said that it was definitely gone in front of him, but he himself thought that he had hit him very hard. Security guards began to emerge from the building, shouting that the offender needed to be found and captured, and that he had to return the relics. Li remembered being followed and the man asking him if he had stolen something. The young man pointed to the bag and calmly said that he hadn't taken anything special, just a couple of trinkets. Hugo was very surprised and asked Li if he had stolen the relics from Yang Wei's storage, and he agreed. The man grabbed the guy by the lapels and said that there was nothing cool about it, and Li just laughed cheerfully. One of the guards told the man that they needed to catch the thief right away, but he replied that he was beyond their reach. And then he noticed that the rascal definitely couldn't handle him, even though everyone thought he was quite strong. The guard was very surprised. Suddenly a very strong wind arose, which began to swirl the green leaves. Hugo was very surprised. At this time, a huge, muscular beast began to jump from the roof of the building. All this happened in complete silence. The head of the guard bowed his head, frowned. Beads of sweat appeared on his face, and he said that he was here. The avatar of the constellation Aries, the beast of abundance, whose name is Pishu, landed on the earth. The men looked at the huge beast, and Li Gang read the system message. It warned that Pishu could steal money and relics. Li Gang looked at the beast calmly, and Hugo Otis was very scared. He said that it was very bad that the avatar of Aries appeared. The man asked Li to leave everything and run away, but Gan told him to just stand and watch. A sly smile appeared on the young man's face, and he said that he had a plan. Li Gang ordered the slime to give him a knife, and he began to carry out the order. A few seconds later, a cold weapon appeared in the slime's mouth, and the guy reached for it. The young man took the knife in his hand and began to wave it. He was calm and collected. Then Li raised the knife up and thought that it wouldn't be suitable for fighting the avatar in this state. But the guy had an original plan. His eyes were shining, and he told the avatar to show his true form. A very strong wind blew. Hugo began to cover his face with his hand and thought about what kind of force this was. Everything around began to collapse and crumble, and day very quickly turned to night. Li said that it was much better this way, and instead of a knife, he had a huge sword in his hands. A message appeared in front of Gan that the awakened relic was imbued with the aura of Ophiuchus, and it had acquired more deadly characteristics. The guy got acquainted with the messages and was very happy that he had acquired a new skill. Li Gang smiled. His eyes were burning with fire, and he made the decision to use the power of the 13th. The guy looked at the beast and thought that now he could easily see all its weak points. Li Gang raised his weapon and said that it was time to warm up a bit. Hugo told the boy that rushing at the enemy without thinking is Li's tactic. The man noted that Gan always overcomes obstacles despite his recklessness. The man looked at the boy. There was a smile on his face. He mentally told him that he congratulated him on his return. The beast also did not stand aside and did not cool down. He was very angry and hit the asphalt with his paw. So where was Gan? Hugo Otis was so scared that beads of sweat appeared on his face. He called out loudly for Li. Aries' avatar looked at the man in surprise, and Hugo, out of nowhere, heard the guy's voice, most likely from the animal's belly. Li is under the beast, began to come out and said that there was a very strong stench there. He almost died from the smell of pork. The young man's eyes were shining with anger. There was a sly smile on his face, and he said that now it was his turn. The animal's eyes were burning with anger. It clenched its teeth very tightly, since it could not break away from the guy. Li Gang didn't wait long. He immediately got down to business. The guy wielded a huge sword like a feather, and the wounded animal screamed as if in frenzy from pain, saliva spraying from its mouth in all directions. A system message appeared in front of the young man, informing him that the beast was using its skill. The beast opened its mouth wide and screamed, and Lee read in the message that Pishu was absorbing all the valuables that came within range. Lee squeezed his sword even tighter and said that the beast should have behaved quietly, but now it would not escape punishment. Gan raised his weapon very high and read the system message that the Ophiuchus trait had been activated. Lee's eyes lit up. He smiled and said that one slight paresis should be enough. And the young man hit the asphalt with all his might, and pieces of asphalt, dust, and dirt flew in all directions. Pishu also got caught in the crossfire. He screamed like a madman, opened his mouth very wide, from which sharp, white teeth were visible. A very strong wind arose, which lifted the boulders like feathers, and the guards who were standing nearby screamed in horror. Hugo Otis also screamed very loudly. He was surprised, and from fear beads of sweat appeared on his face. Li Gang frowned. He smiled a sarcastic smile and was satisfied with the effect he wanted to achieve. Hugo brought his hand to his face to wipe away the beads of sweat, and thought that the guy really did have power. The man looked at the boy and thought about how powerful he had been in his prime. System messages appeared in front of the guy, and he read that he had defeated the Avatar, and his experience of the sacred throne had increased. The system asked if Gan wanted to have the Beast of Abundance as an avatar, a question that caught the guy off guard. He approached the beast, which was no longer dangerous, and said that he thought that only 12 saints could have avatars. The guy walked up to the beast, put his hand on its head, and used force. Pishu came to life, and a system message reported that the beast had become an avatar of the constellation Ophiuchus, and Lee only had one avatar. A few minutes later, the beast shrank in size and jumped into the arms of its new owner. Lee said it would be great to use Pisha as a keeper of his relics. Gan tossed the beast and caught it, and Hugo watched and said with surprise that Lee had appropriated an avatar from another branch. He wondered when he had acquired this skill. The system message reported that Lee can give the beast a new name. The guy was very surprised. The young man thought for a moment, and then, with a smile on his face, said that the animal would be called Pig Bank. It was getting dark. The conversation was taking place in the house, when someone very loudly called their man a traitor. Hugo shouted why he was a traitor, because he was very worried about Lee, and the guy noted that while he was in captivity, he built a family and enjoyed life. Gan said that he was going through pain and suffering, and his friend was passing the happy days and did not try to find him, and when he returned, he did not even recognize him. Lee got up from the couch and said that he would not bother Hugo with his presence, and he replied that everything was fine and that Gan could spend the night with him, since he lived alone. Gan said he shouldn't have brought it up and said divorce wasn't a tragedy as Otis shouted that he wasn't divorced. The man put his hand to his head and said that they needed to continue where they left off, and asked Lee to tell them what was happening inside the tower. Hugo said that during the raid, he stayed outside to hold back the incoming forces of monsters, and does not know what happened, but the guys returned with the head of Red Eye. Lee noted that it was a very sob story because he was stabbed in the back and left to rot in a tower. It was a trap teeming with countless hordes of lures. Gan said that among the hordes of these creatures, Red Eye, whom he thought dead, came back to life. Hugo was very surprised, and asked if Red Eye had really been revived. Lee said that what they saw during the raid was not his real body. Gan noted that the true form was hidden deep within, and even though he managed to win, everything was not so simple. The guy noted that the main thorn in his side was not the red-eyed one, but the tower administrator, who again and again brought back to life all the lures he killed. Lee said he chopped everyone into pieces, and then he was overcome with the feeling that he would not escape from the tower, and the administrator enjoyed his torment. Having finished off the last one, he collapsed to the ground from exhaustion, and if his memory and feelings do not fail him, then at that moment he was already dead. Gan said he opened his eyes and found himself somehow outside the tower, and at that moment, he was filled with a strange power. The guy said that he was sure that whoever hit him was well aware of the structure of the tower. He threw him into the lair of the lures, as if he knew what was waiting for him there. Lee noted that sooner or later he would get to those who had appropriated his property, but the one who had stabbed him in the back would receive a special punishment. Gan said he needed to prepare, make decent equipment. He called the workshop to create anything. The young man looked through the system messages and muttered something under his breath. The guy looked at the relics with a smile and then said that they just needed to be mixed together. Lee did not hesitate, but began to create a new relic, and the process began. A system message reported that a new relic had been created. A new entity, the false Crimson Horse, had been recreated. Lee looked at the relic and noticed that one like his was capable of developing on its own, and Hugo was only surprised. The man began to look closely at the relic and said that it was very valuable, so its design was simply disgusting. Lee screamed. Was Hugo making fun of him? Didn't he see how much material he had poured into this subject? Gan said that he had been thinking about making something for Otis with the remaining materials, but now he suddenly changed his mind. Hugo immediately said that the item had an elegant design. He is a true master in making beautiful relics. Lee replied that he would look at Otis's behavior, began to open the bag and said that the first thing to do was to somehow lure all the saints. Hugo asked how Lee would do this. Since the other constellations would hardly dare to leave their residences, Gan took out a chest and noted that this would be enough. Otis was very surprised because he saw the royal relic of Ares, the vault golden rune. The man opened his mouth in surprise and said that the royal relics were the most valuable artifacts one could ever find, and asked how Lee had obtained them. Lee said Hugo was the saint of the beggar constellation. He brought this thing to use as a wallet. The man shouted that his constellation was called Wrong. Gan asked the man if he knew that high-grade relics required much more materials than regular ones, and now he could create high-grade relics. Otis spread his arms and asked how he would do this, since there was no one here who could activate it. Lee asked what about Hugo then, and he started shouting at the guy not to look at him like that and asked if they had forgotten that his sign was Sagittarius. The room became very quiet, and then Li Gang replied that Otis was telling the truth. The guy looked at the chest and said that he had a feeling that they would be able to activate it, and Hugo noted that it wouldn't work, and they needed to look for another way out. The man smiled, and Gan said that he had already sent an application to the news network. Hugo was surprised and asked the guy again what he had done and what he had sent to the news network, and he said that he would try differently. The young man became very angry and started shouting at Lee and asking him if he had gone crazy. Young people gathered in the Blue House. The elders were calling out their subordinates because they were unable to deal with one spider. The bishop of the Leo branch said that they should continue trading talismans and asked why they were getting into battles with the lures. The man told the bishop to refrain from such statements, and he said that he heard that the Spider Queen was killed by an unknown person. Then he asked if Li Gang had risen from the grave, but he was quickly killed. The Gemini branch bishop told the Leo branch bishop that he must be very fascinated by Li Gan's achievements. And he asked what was wrong with that, since Li Gang had destroyed that creature without much difficulty, and asked if the guy had seen the video of Russia burning. The guy with glasses said that Li was strengthened by the saints and gave him their best weapons. The bishop of the Lion branch laughed and said that they were not given the conditions. The Gemini branch bishop said that the Spider Queen was destroyed by them, the Gemini branch, at the cost of a high-ranking Templar's life. His partner started laughing and noticed that they, poor things, had paid a huge price, and he wanted to shake the poor thing's hand, but he was in the monster's stomach. The altercation continued, and an elderly man watched from the side, clenching his teeth. After a while, he frowned and thought that the Blue House had become a den for scumbags. A security guard ran into the room and said that he had an urgent message for Mr. President and asked to turn on the news. The announcer on TV said that they had an emergency broadcast and reported that their news channel had received a mysterious package. The man said that inside were photographs of the holy sign of Ares, Yang Wei, as well as a short message, and the test results confirmed that the handwriting was Li Gang's. Hugo Otis was screaming very loudly. His mouth and eyes were wide open, and beads of sweat appeared on his face. He asked Lee what he was thinking by sending something like that, and Gan said it was just an announcement, letting them know that their heads would soon be on his plate. Hugo clutched his head and said that Yang Wei's death itself was a huge problem, and Lee made it worse with his message. The guy lowered his head and calmly said that Yang Wei was not dead as everyone thought. Otis was very surprised, and Lee added that, to be more precise, it was hard to call Jan alive. Hugo didn't understand anything. He opened his eyes and mouth in surprise. Beads of sweat appeared on his face. The guy picked up the stuffed toy and told Otis that it was Yang Wei. The man thought that Li Gang was a complete scumbag. The man gritted his teeth and stuttered, asking if this toy was really Yang Wei. Li replied that thanks to recent battles, his skills had improved slightly, and he had sealed his astral body into a toy. Hugo was very surprised. He could not believe that something like this was possible. and Lee said that this was not the main thing and gave the man a dagger. Gan told Otis that this was the dagger that was stabbed into his back, the weapon that was the reason for his imprisonment. Hugo took it in his hand and thought that this was the object that almost caused Gan's death, and the dagger, judging by its shape, was far from ordinary. Otis said that if Lee was injured by him, then it was definitely not Yang Wei. The guy asked if maybe he should apologize to Yang then. Gan told Hugo that he was going to visit the shopping mall, and then asked why he needed to do so. Lee replied that the pig said that she had seen a blade with a similar shape there, and asked Otis to lend him some clothes, which he did not refuse. The young man quickly changed his clothes and told slave number 2 to protect the house, and the man asked if he had slave number 1. The guy waved his hand and said that he would be back soon and called Otis slave number 1. He got very angry and started screaming like a madman. A group of people arrived at the site where Yang Wei's estate once stood, but it was now completely destroyed. The girl said into the earpiece to Miss Sacred Aquarius that as expected. But the constellation of Aries has not been there for a long time. The aura of the sacred essence is not felt. Miss was just taking a bath, and with a smile on her face, asked where he could have disappeared to. The security girl said that he most likely took his property and intentionally disappeared somewhere, and added that everything was very bad if he made deals with other saints. Sophie Mard was wondering where the bald, fat man had run off to, and the security guard asked if Yang Wei had been kidnapped by Li Gang, since there were rumors that he had returned. Miss Saint Aquarius began to laugh very cheerfully after these words. She could not stop for a long time. After some time, she let go and told her friend that it was a very stupid joke. The girl replied that she was very sorry, as she said it without thinking, then added that they would visit the shopping mall as they had planned earlier. She wanted to say something else about the auction, but Sophie's bathroom door opened and security shouted that they were in trouble. The girl informed Miss Saint that another saint had expressed a desire to take part in the auction, which surprised her greatly. There were guys in the sports club who were very scared, with beads of sweat on their faces. They came up behind Mr. Stephen as he was lifting the barbell and called him by name. One of the men said that they had received information that the relic, which belonged to Li Gang, would be auctioned off. The athlete threw the dumbbell on the floor in surprise, then smiled and asked if the time had really come. Stephen was incredibly happy. His eyes were shining, he said with a smile, that they would take the relic for themselves. Lee told Sun that the teleporter was a very convenient thing, and he noted that they were very expensive, but members of the Gemini branch could use them for free. The guys were standing near the relic trading complex and looking at the signs. There were a huge number of them there. Gan told the young man that he was grateful to him, because he needed the help of an expert, and he volunteered to help him. Sun replied that he was always ready to help, and he himself remembered the words of the bishop of the Gemini branch, who asked to recruit the man who killed the Spider Queen. The young man took out his phone and read his boss's messages, and Lee noted that his boss was pestering him despite that incident in the hypermarket. Gan extended his hand in which lay the dagger and said that he was returning it, and added that the weapon had helped a lot in the battle with the bugs. Song said he thought the blade had broken after that battle. Lee said he had completely restored it, and then noted that the effectiveness might change slightly. The boy put the blade to his chest and thanked Gan, who put his hand to his forehead and noticed that they had already arrived. He looked at the light that was pouring from the windows and asked the young man if they had come to where the rank assessor was. The young man looked to the side in surprise. His pupils narrowed very much. He was definitely not prepared for this. He blushed and said that it was amazing to see such a person in such a place, and the guy who was standing next to him could only say that she was beautiful. Surrounded by a huge number of guards, Miss Saint Aquarius walked. Sophie Mard was absolutely calm, looking at those present with a slight smile. Miss approached one gentleman and told him that she wanted to get rid of several relics before the auction began, but he replied that the appraiser was currently busy with another client. Sophie was very angry, but she didn't show it. She said that everything was fine and she would wait her turn. Miss Saint stood near the building where the appraiser was located and wondered who was inside. There was Lee, who asked the youth if the ranker really owned this place, and then noted that the prices were in keeping with his rank. The appraiser picked up the statue and asked Song Jae who made it, and Li Gang calmly replied that he did. The man who was conducting the assessment began to stutter and then asked if he was somehow related to Li Gang. Song was very nervous. and replied that the guy next to him was a Gan impersonator, and the appraiser asked to leave them with Lee. He wanted to ask a few questions. The red-haired guy went to the exit, and the appraiser began to ask how the young man was connected with Lee Gan. He could not understand what was going on. The man said that many people don't know that Lee Gang is famous for his fighting skills, and besides that, he is also a skilled craftsman. The appraiser stated that the relic the young man brought was definitely not a fake, and his instinct told him that Lee Gang himself had a hand in it. The boy laughed and told the man that he seemed to be very knowledgeable about Ghana, and he agreed. The appraiser blushed, frowned, narrowed his eyes, and quietly said that he was Lee's favorite student. The guy looked at his friend in surprise and wondered why he had blushed. Lee folded his arms across his chest, squinted one eye, and thought that he didn't remember ever having any students, and the man noted that the boy could not learn from him, since he was very young, and then added that the work amazed him, and he almost believed in its authenticity. Gan was very angry. The young man realized that he was dealing with a fraud, and the appraiser showed the item and said that he had received it when he was recognized as Lee Gang's disciple. The guy looked at the notebook and thought that he had once lost it and began to suspect something. Lee remembered the annoying newcomer who followed him around everywhere in China. He was so fed up with him then. The young man thought that he had aged a lot in 20 years, and the appraiser said that Lee Gang had a keen sense of beauty. But when he disappeared, he left a notebook in his house, and the guy thought he had lost it, but it turned out that the man had simply stolen it. The appraiser opened the notebook and said that he could not decipher Lee's handwriting and that there were many brilliant ideas hidden in this notebook, and Gan remembered that there was a list of his victims in it. The guy thought that after waking up he always received information with what he fought with, but this guy would be able to get much more information. But the mustachioed man handed the young man a notebook and said that it would serve the young talent better than him. The guy picked up the notebook and was happy, because it contained his first sketches, and he was very upset when he lost it. Lee held the notebook and saw a message in front of him that the item's dormant magic had reacted to the owner's aura, and it had been transformed into a relic. The appraiser shouted that it was a memory-type relic, and then said that Lee Gang had cast a spell on the notebook when he was alive. Someone entered the room and told the gentleman that they had big problems. He was very surprised. The man asked what had happened, and the young man said that the saint had been waiting outside for a long time. Usati calmly said that they raised a fuss over a mere trifle, and Lee was very surprised when he heard the name Saint. The girl continued to wait. She folded her arms across her chest. She was guarded by security, but the paparazzi still tried to take pictures of Sophie. The saint bowed her head and thought about how these worthless people dared to stare at her. She noticed that the same thing happened every time. People gathered in a crowd. One young man thought that Sophie Mard only appeared at official meetings because she was too picky for such outings. The saint told the guards that they had been waiting too long, and it was a waste of time. She thought she should go in and hurry them up personally. The girl really wanted to sell the relics. A security guard approached Sophie and said that there was still a client inside. She became interested in who was there, because it was because of him that the saint was disrespected. She really wanted to see that smug face and ran into the room, saw the appraiser and Lee Gan there. Miss Saint looked around, staring at the men, her eyes growing very big in surprise. The girl stared at Lee Gan and couldn't take her eyes off him. The guy looked at her absolutely calmly. A blush appeared on Sophie's face. She thought that in front of her was a magnificent, handsome man. She wanted to look at him a little closer. Literally a minute later, a snake appeared before the beauty's eyes, its eyes burning with fire. The saint was very frightened. Her mouth opened in surprise, and the pupils of her eyes became like dots. The girl was so frightened that she couldn't stand on her feet and fell to her knees. The guards immediately ran up to her and started asking if everything was okay. Sophie's face broke out in beads of sweat as she thought about the terrifying aura she had just felt. Miss Saint felt as if hundreds of poisonous snakes were coiled around her body. Sophie realized that she needed to run away from here quickly and turned towards the exit, and people started shouting after her. The appraiser wondered why Saint had run away, and Lee noted that the girl had become unwell. A system message appeared in front of Gan, indicating that a subordinate of another sacred entity had approached him. He thought that this was not the same as magical power. He clenched his hand into a fist and read that divinity was necessary to maintain the powers of the sacred entity. Gan asked the man if it was true that the girl who came in was a saint, and he was surprised and noted that she appeared in all the news stories about saints. The appraiser paused for a moment and said that it was Sophie Mard, the holy sign of Aquarius. Lee was surprised. The guy laughed so hard that tears came to his eyes and said that he was puzzled that everyone was so upset about the saint, but it turned out to be Sophie. Gan thought that the girl had changed quite a bit. It was no wonder that he didn't recognize her right away. She had always been pretty, but her rotten soul wouldn't go away. The boy thought about how there were categories of things he despised, including pests, fish bones, and sewage, and Sophie was a pest. The man told Lee that he didn't understand why she was considered the saint of mercy and self-sacrifice. The girl had a nasty character, and Gan laughed. Usati said that Sophie had once provided healing assistance to Lee, so she wanted to appropriate his property and the matter passed into the hands of the government. The appraiser told the boy that he thought Sophie would call his name and noted that they probably knew Saint. Gan replied with a smile on his face that they were old friends. At this time, Miss Saint ran wherever her eyes looked, with security running after her and shouting if everything was okay with Sophie. The girl remembered Lee's face, who asked her if she wanted to die, and thought about why she remembered his face at that moment. Sophie said that the magical aura that wanted to absorb her was similar to that person's aura, and noticed that she became very scared. Death did not frighten her so much. Miss Saint told the security guard to go back to the pawn shop and find out who the man was. The assistant asked about the appraiser. Sophie thought about something for a few seconds, and then with a smile on her face said that she had changed her mind. Miss Saint's eyes lit up with a blue fire. She became cheerful, and the girl told the security to finish them off. The assistant said that the appraiser was under the protection of the Virgo branch, and they still needed to sell him the relics, and Sophie said that they both deserved to be punished. She promised the security guard that she would hand her the relic and lend her a piece of the sacred essence, but she told her that magic cannot be used in the neutral zone. Sophie asked her assistant if she was refusing to carry out her orders and looked at her with a smile. The security guard replied that no, she would never dare, because the wish of a saint is the wish of a sacred entity, and the assistant knelt before Miss Saint and stretched out her hands to her. The security guard said that the wish of the sacred entity was the wish of the heavens themselves, and Sophie placed the ornament in her palm. The assistant said how she could resist the order of one of the 12 saints who support the whole world. Li Gang stood in the pawn shop, watched the dripping from the ceiling, and asked why their roof was leaking. Everything was ready in the relic trading complex. The main action was taking place in the central area. People walked past different shops, various signs were lit up, they beckoned to buyers. Sun was also walking, sipping a drink through a straw. When he stopped, he was very surprised. The guy looked at his feet and thought that there was no rain, but why was there water spilled here? He leaned over, began to examine his reflection, and thought about the magical energy emanating from her. And then a hand began to appear from the puddle, reaching out to the young man. Sun was very scared. The glass with the drink fell from his hands and it spilled. A huge water man appeared from the puddle, crawled towards the young man and looked at him with unusual eyes. The guy was seriously scared. Beads of sweat appeared on his face. He wondered what was going on here. The young man was distracted from his thoughts by some sound, and he turned his head, and what he saw shocked him. Watermen also appeared in front of other people. Some were scared by this. Some decided that it was some kind of show. Miss Saint was watching everything that was happening. She just laughed merrily because she liked this performance. Sophie decided to use such an ability as a duplicate mirror. A strong wind blew. The girl was very pleased with herself and noted that the summoned creatures could only match the rank of the Templars, but problems could arise if an entire army of bugs attacked them. There was a serious security guard named Sophie standing nearby. Sun saw her and started calling her, but she pretended not to hear anything. The guy started yelling at her about why she was using combat skills in the neutral zone and demanded that she stop doing it immediately. The girl calmly said that this was the order of the saint, so he shouldn't worry. This answer surprised Sun very much. The security guard said that she was acting at the will of the gods and began to activate the relic. The guy was very scared. He screamed very loudly that this shouldn't be done and put his hand forward. But the young man was not strong enough to prevent the activation of the relic, and the negative process was launched. The water seemed to be playing with people. It covered them, took them into its merciless captivity. Sophie told the assistant that the job was done perfectly, and she would deal with the guy from the relic appraisal point, and the security told her to grab the appraiser. The red-haired guy was also captivated by the water. He was in water bubble and understood that he had to act. Sun knew he needed to get out of there as soon as possible before he lost consciousness. The young man became very ill, and from the lack of oxygen, his pupils became like dots. At that time, Lee was in the pawn shop and looking at the huge wet spot, which was only growing in size. An appraiser approached him and reported that something was happening outside. He noted that he felt strange flows of magic. Suddenly the water gushed out in a huge stream. It not only swept away everything in its path, but also began to take men captive. Li Gang looked down and looked in surprise at the stream of water that passed by his neck. Literally a second later, the water turned into a blade, and Sophie's assistant stood behind the guy and told him not to move. The young man was not at all afraid. He continued to stand calmly. The girl told him that she had nothing personal, but he dared to offend the saint. Sophie's assistant said that if the guy doesn't want bloodshed, then let him behave calmly. The girl added that the saint had ordered them both to be killed, but if the appraiser offered a sincere apology and bought the relics at a high price, she would put in a good word for him. The man was trapped in the water but did not react to these words at all. Lee said it was not allowed to brandish a knife in public places, and he noted that he had not thought about using a weapon. The appraiser was freed from the water trap. The gun fell to the floor, and Gan told the man to ask for compensation for the damage caused. Jin Man thought that the knife was a gift from the Aquarius constellation, but the guy was able to destroy it with his bare hands. The girl clenched her teeth. Her eyes burned with hatred, and she muttered that she told the young man not to resist. Miss Saint's assistant began to use her special powers. The appraiser was thrown back several meters by water sweat, and Lee stood as if nothing had happened. The guy was having a lot of fun. Then he clenched his fist tightly. The water didn't scare him at all. He turned to the girl in glasses and asked with a smile if she had any more special effects like these, since the sensations from them were simply amazing. She got really angry. She thought that this was some kind of nonsense. The guy destroyed a rank clone with one blow. She knew it, because Saint felt bad for a reason. The girl looked at Lee and understood that he was dangerous, so she needed to deal with him as quickly as possible before he created even more problems. Sophie's assistant took out some artifact. She was very nervous and concluded that he definitely wouldn't be able to handle it. The streams of water appeared again, and the girl noted that they were created by the purest magic of the saint. The girl held the artifact in her hand and began to summon orange-class monsters. Water wolves began to appear. Li Gang smiled cheerfully and noted that these pests were very happy to see him. The young man took the blades that were lying on the display case and asked the appraiser a question. The guy asked G-Man and told them to take what he liked and said that he would lend these blades. The man didn't even have time to answer, let alone blink, before the young man had disappeared. Li Gang used his powers and went to meet the water wolves that were near the saint's assistant. The guy immediately began to attack the monsters. He was happy like a child and said that these daggers were very good. The water wolves' faces were distorted, and Lee said he had the feeling that they were no stronger than yard dogs. He understood that it was the weapons. The guy didn't stop. He said he was just planning to have his items evaluated, but he got something much better. A huge number of system messages appeared in front of the young man. His experience was increased, which could not but please. The girl who held the artifact in her hands thought that this couldn't be, because the guy had destroyed the saint's calls so easily. Lee felt a surge of strength and turned his head to tell his assistant Sophie that they weren't finished yet. The girl began to shake with fear. She understood that they were on different levels, and if she tried to attack, she would die immediately. So she couldn't think of anything better to do than run away. But while running away, he said that that wasn't all. Li Gang laughed at her and noted that the idiots who shouted that it was not the end were the most pathetic. G frowned. Beads of sweat appeared on his face. He understood that the person in front of him was not simple and asked the guy if everything was okay with him. Lee didn't have time to answer, as Sun flew into the room and shouted that he had been attacked by a Templar from the Aquarius branch and that he had barely escaped. Gan was glad to see the guy and told him that they had just finished here. Z stuttered and asked what had happened here. The guy began to look at the water wolves, which no longer posed a threat, and said that this was magical energy, similar to the calls of the saint. Lee said that by sending something like this to him, they were giving him resources, but Song said that they had better leave before the next attack. Then G-Man turned to the guys. He asked the guys to wait a minute. They looked at him questioningly. The appraiser thought that 20 years ago he had followed Li Gang and listened to his art, and he clearly remembered how he collected materials after every battle with monsters. The man told Li that he fought like a demon, this crazy fighting style, and timidly asked if it was Gan in front of him. The boy looked G-Man in the eyes and put his finger to his lips. The man frowned, tears flowed from his eyes, and beads of sweat appeared on his face, but he only smiled in response. Li told G that he would return for the materials and asked him to keep a close eye on them, then added that he still had some questions. The boys went to the door, and Man leaned over and said that they should definitely come again. The red-haired man began to ask Gan why the saint was so focused on him, and he replied that she was probably unhappy about something. Sun asked if Li had offended her in some way. The young man closed his eyes and replied that this was also possible. The man smiled. His eyes were burning with fire. He said that the boy would soon see something funny. The guys went to a cafe. Li ate ice cream and told Z that it was just awesome here, and offered him to eat as much as he wanted. Sun said that he was very grateful, and then quietly asked if Gan was sure he had enough money, because it could cost a pretty penny. The guy was silent. He was just remembering how the saint's assistant ran away and dropped something. He told Sun that everything was fine, because earlier he had picked up an interesting thing, and with it they had access to many privileges. Li showed it to the young man, and noted that as far as he remembered, this emblem was similar in functionality to a bank card. With it, he could also rent other people's skills. Sun looked at it in surprise, and said that he had not noticed before that it had the Aquarius emblem on it, and he himself thought that they might have problems, because it also serves as an identifier. Li was eating ice cream and told his friend to forget it and think about it after eating, while Song was wondering if he could eat it. A man with glasses walked into the cafe and told Z that he was glad to see him, and then remarked that he didn't think he liked the ice cream there. At first the boy couldn't understand who was talking to him, but he turned his head and saw Bishop Sun Hek. He smiled and asked if he could join them, but no one answered his question. The bishop placed his hand on Jae's shoulder, and Li looked at him and thought that this was the same boss who was bothering Sonu. Sun sat down at the table and said that he was glad to meet them, and introduced himself, and then turned to Gan and asked if Z had told him that he was unfriendly. Hek replied that the young man had told him that he had met a truly amazing person who had been able to defeat the Spider Queen, while Yang Wei had failed miserably. Li Gang continued to eat his ice cream, looked at the man, and then asked him what he had to do with all this. The bishop said one of his main tasks is to recruit promising awakened people. The young man was very surprised, and then asked Sun what he could offer him. He laughed and said that one of the 8 relics of Li Gang himself would be auctioned off, and suggested that they continue the conversation and enjoy the auction process. The guy was surprised, and thought that they were playing a prank on his relics. Sun knows how to intrigue. The boy replied that it all sounded quite interesting, and then asked how far the auction house was from here, and Song told him to wipe the ice cream off his face first. The bishop smiled and replied that the auction would be held nearby and noted that there would be very rare relics there. The man said that the premises were located 16,000 feet above the ground and housed the largest auction house. In the floating city of Drachma, there was a large auction house of Drachma. It was very tall. Miss Saint was sitting in one of the chairs in the room, hugging herself with her arms and shaking violently. She didn't look very well. The girl was very upset. She was thinking about something. A man sitting nearby and holding a glass of drink in his hands noticed her. He was very angry and told Sophie to get lost if she planned to continue shaking in the corner. The saint looked at the speaker and thought that he was the same stupid and ill-mannered bore, but now she had to control herself. Sophie looked at the huge, muscular man and thought that he was very strong. He was able to surpass Li Gan. There was no place safer than next to him. Stephen Marker said that Li Gang's relic would definitely be his, and the saint would not even dare to lay claim to it. The man went to the exit, and Sophie asked where he was going. He replied that it was none of his business, let her sit and not move. The saint sat, looked out the window, and told herself that she just needed to calm down, and whoever that person was, he would not be able to get in here. Sophie began to look ahead and was very surprised when she saw a familiar silhouette. There was a blond man named Hugo Otis. The girl didn't expect to see him here. The saint smiled and thought that the desired guest had appeared just in time. The man looked around and wondered where Li Gang was. He had disappeared somewhere again. Otis thought that knowing the guy's character, He was sure that he would come here, because the city of Drachma is a real treasure trove of precious relics. Miss Saint crept up behind Hugo and told the man that they hadn't seen him for a long time, and he became scared. And the girl, with a humble smile on her face, began to ask how Hugo Otis was doing. Otis turned his head, frowned, and clenched his teeth. He was not very happy to see Sophie marred. Miss Saint smiled at Hugo and said that she couldn't get through to him. Sophie laughed and said that time spares no one, and before he was a handsome man who represented all the saints, but now his face has changed a lot. The girl asked if this was due to the small number of followers. The man just waved his hand and said that he did not want to talk to her. Miss Saint started laughing loudly and said that Hugo had decided to ignore her again. And then she added angrily that Otis's son would suffer the same fate as his wife. Sophie laughed even louder and added that his wife was not yet dead, but her condition was indistinguishable from death. The girl did not calm down. She began to talk about how the shame had been brought upon his house by none other than the head of the family. The man could barely contain himself. He was burning with hatred for Miss Sophie, and she continued to laugh. If there had been a guy in front of Otis, he would have definitely hit him, but he ordered Miss Saint to get lost. He just raised his fist to her face, but Sophie didn't stop. She continued to be sarcastic, said that he was holding back, and she thought that he had forgotten about the agreement signed 20 years ago. Miss Saint had a water balloon in her hand and asked if she should teach the arrogant boy a lesson. The girl's expression changed very quickly. She couldn't understand what was happening to her. Li Gang quietly approached Sophie and Hugo and smashed the water balloon into pieces. The girl jumped in surprise. Miss Sviata turned around and saw the guy, whom I encountered in a pawn shop, and screamed in horror. The young man did not hesitate. He used his powers, and the beauty fell from her height to the floor. Hugo looked at his comrade in surprise. He opened his mouth and did not know what to say. The man only said the name of his comrade, who frowned and extended his hand. Then Gan asked Otis what he was doing there, and he replied that he was worried about him, since they couldn't take their eyes off him. Lee couldn't understand why he was worried and then asked if Hugo was really in love. He replied that he had enough of this nonsense. The men leaned over Miss Saint, and Gan wanted to say something else to his comrade. Sophie looked completely unpresentable. There was a huge bump on her forehead. Foam was coming out of her mouth, and Lee asked why he always bumped into this girl. Gan looked at her and said that she had a crush on him, and Hugo thought that the guy had some kind of problem with his head. An image of the number 12 appeared in front of Miss Saint, and she immediately thought of Li Gan. The girl looked at everything with fear. Beads of sweat appeared on her face. She realized that the 13th constellation was the strongest, but Sophie had always been afraid of it and disliked it. She was frightened by the disgusting face covered in scars, the cruel disposition, and the arrogant look that pierced to the bones. The events took place 20 years ago. Li Gang was in a hurry somewhere, and the girls tried to stop him. The maid told the guy that he was in the residence of the Aquarius sign and asked him to leave this place. But he came very close to the woman and calmly told her to send, and she was very scared. She began to wring her hands and scream, asking how to understand such an attitude towards her. But Lee didn't care. Sophie walked up to the guy, folded her arms across her chest, and asked with hatred how Gan dared to break into her house. And she added that he should leave, but the guy did not stand on ceremony and hit the girl on the shoulder with all his might. The young man pulled her towards him, looked straight into her eyes, and asked if she wanted to die. He began to take his hand away, and Sophie stuttered and asked what he was doing and how long it would continue, since she had sent him to the rear to treat the injured. Miss Saint began to ask why he was idle, and the young man replied that many of those people were left without arms and legs because they tried to save her life. Lee took the girl's hand and said that she had talked about helping people when she came here, and replied that it was time to go and keep his promise. Sophie replied that what difference did it make if a couple more people died? On the contrary, they should be happy that they had the chance to save her, because she is a saint. Lee continued to pull the beauty by the hand, and she said that due to constant stress, she had developed problems with her facial skin, and she was not going to go there for the sake of stupid choirs. The young man stopped, turned his head, looked at the girl, and then asked what she said. Sophie thought about Lee's smell of sweat and told him to get lost, because she had to put on makeup before she had an interview. Miss Saint began to pull her hand out of the guy's hand and screamed at him to let her go. She rubbed her wrist and asked why he had squeezed it so hard and thought about how Gan's hand was so dirty. The guy couldn't control himself after all these words and hit the girl in the face with all his might. Even outside the palace, Lee could be heard screaming. If the girl weren't a parasite, she might be reachable, but he wouldn't get anywhere until he beat all the rot out of her. Gan had forced the girl to treat the wounded and she had hated him, and now the guy was standing over her and asking if she had been sleeping for too long. When Miss Saint came to, she was seated on a chair and tied up so that she would not kick. Lee sat down opposite Sophie and looked at her without taking his eyes off her. She stared at the young man. After a few minutes, the girl screamed loudly to be untied immediately and began to ask how they dared to treat the saint like that. Lee calmly said that Sophie hadn't changed a bit in 20 years and asked how she managed it, and Otis noted that he was also wondering the same thing. Miss Saint cursed silently and thought that they wouldn't get away with this just like that, because she was no longer the weak girl she used to be. She began to use force and thought that it would not be difficult for her to melt the rope that was on her hands. The girl narrowed her eyes and thought that men would not be able to keep her with something like that, unless she managed to meet Stephen Marker. The flow of thoughts was interrupted by a juicy flick that Sophie gave Lee. The girl screamed in pain and surprise. Gan told Miss Saint that it was written on her face that she was up to something. The guy looked at his finger, from which smoke was coming, and asked what was going on. Sophie started laughing and happily called Lee stupid because he didn't realize that she had an acid layer on her to protect her from all outside attacks. The girl said that the acid would spread throughout his body and eat away at the guy from the inside. He started screaming for her to forgive him, and then said that she had imagined this. Sophie said that this was the absolute protection of the Aquarius constellation, and the young man showed her his middle finger, on which the wound from the acid had already disappeared. The girl's face was covered in beads of sweat. She screamed and thought about how the melted tissues were restored so instantly, because this is real cheating. And Gan called Sophie a parasite, and said that it was time to remember everything that happened between them. He noted that he heard how she lied to everyone, and for this she would receive one blow. The guy noticed that it was she who sent her subordinate to the appraiser, for which 5 more blows are added, and asked what she said to Otis, and said that for this another 50 blows are added. Miss Saint asked Lee to stop, a request that surprised him greatly. But the young man did not listen to the girl, but began to flick her face. She screamed in pain, asking the guy to stop, but he was still as if he had become deaf, and Hugo sat to the side and sipped coffee. Otis thought that Gan was really good at beating the crap out of people regardless of their gender. The fair-haired man was very surprised. He had a wonderful feeling, as it turned out. With each blow from Lee, his level of divinity increased. Gan didn't even think about stopping, and a huge number of system messages appeared in front of him. The man was thinking about what kind of divinity he was building up, and in this Sophie hung her head very low. The girl had a huge bump on her forehead. Foam came out of her mouth, and the guy noticed that she had passed out. Lee read the message that her divinity was unlocked, and the boy said to be reminded of what it was. And before the guy there appeared explanations about what divinity is, how it can be obtained and lost. He scratched his head and thought that now by kicking asses he was taking away their divinity, but he couldn't knock it out of Yang Wei because it wasn't unlocked at that time. The guy looked at his hand and thought that he had to become stronger anyway. Otis asked Gan if he thought he should ask Sophie about the dagger. He replied that she wouldn't have had the balls to attack him, and then added that he had found someone who could look at that dagger. Hugo thought that Lee was just teasing Sophie for fun when the guy's phone rang. Gan showed him the time, and Otis asked the young man where he got the smartphone. He replied that he borrowed it from a red-haired guy. Lee told the man that it was time for him to go to the auction room and asked him to clean it up thoroughly and suggested throwing the saint into the nearest trash can. The guy started to enter the room and told Otis that he would call him as soon as the auction ended. The man wanted to tell him something, but he retreated very quickly. Hugo thought about what to do with him. Someone entered the room and the young man asked him what he was doing there. Otis wondered why, of all the people, the one who was definitely not expected was here. It was Stephen Marker. He put his hands behind his back and began to look around the room and naturally saw Miss Saint. Hugo looked at him, his forehead furrowed and his lips pressed tightly together, but he said nothing. Marker was very angry. He frowned, his eyes were burning with fire, and he told Otis that he had to explain himself. The jock started to take off his glasses and said that he and Otis had not seen each other for a very long time. Stephen frowned so much that his veins bulged, and then said that Sagittarius didn't seem very happy to see them. Hugo calmly asked Marker what he was doing there, and he replied that he and Aquarius had made a deal. Sophie had asked him to be her bodyguard. The man said he had some business in Drachma, and he agreed, and Miss Saint was still sitting unconscious, tied to the chair. Stephen said that it was his turn to ask questions, and asked why Otis was here. He replied that he also had his own business. The jock angrily asked if he was aiming for Ligon's relics, and Hugo asked in surprise if his relic would really be auctioned off. Marker smiled and asked if Sagittarius didn't know that, and then added that he was the most pathetic creature and still couldn't afford her. Hugo replied to Leo that he was always going around picking up old relics of Ghana. He added that Stephen had tried to ignore Lee for a long time, but his inferiority complex grew and he had sunk to the point of collecting all the relics. Otis asked Marker with a smile if he thought he could become as strong as him this way. The jock got very angry. His anger caused a loud explosion and stones flew in all directions. Hugo thought that Stephen had definitely gone crazy. As soon as Gan was mentioned, he couldn't control himself. Marker grabbed Otis's arm with all his might and told him to stop talking nonsense about that weakling and stop saying his name. And then he added that he had long ago become much stronger than him. Leo's eyes burned with hatred. A young man ran into the room and told Stephen that they had problems. He said that the Gemini branch was buying up all of Ligon's relics, and Marker was very surprised. Leo told Sagittarius that he didn't have time to mess with him, and he just laughed. Stephen went to the door and told Hugo to do whatever he wanted with her, and he was very surprised. The man thought that the jock had come here to save her. The Marker replied that the auction was more important to him, and he had to get there as early as possible, and decided to give advice to Sagittarius so that he would choose his words wisely if he wanted to live long. Otis frowned, then laughed and said that he was very grateful for the unsolicited advice. Hugo was again left in the room with Miss Saint, who still had not come to her senses, was unconscious. The blonde man thought that Stephen Marker was a shitty person. Then he looked at the hand that he was squeezing with all his might, and thought about the fact that Lev didn't even consider him a weakling. And at this time, in the Drachma auction house, in the VIP room, an auction was taking place that many were so eagerly awaiting. The presenter happily said that once again the Gemini branch is taking another lot. The woman said that the first stage of the auction had come to an end, and after a short break the second stage would begin. Li Gang was incredibly happy. He said with pleasure that he received another lot. Bishop Gemini began to congratulate the guy, and noted that he could buy whatever he wanted. The young man told the man that he was too kind because he invited him to the VIP room, and now he buys everything he asks for. The bishop remarked that it was the least he could do for him, and Sun asked if he was sure, since they had already spent an indecently large sum. The man smiled and said that everything was fine and asked Sun to pay for the alcohol, as he had forgotten his card, and he would send the money later. Z agreed, and thought to himself that he had already forked out a lot of money today, but he couldn't object since his boss had asked for help. Lee told them not to worry about the alcohol. He showed the card and noted that he had already paid the bill. The bishop thought that the guy had his black card. He had no idea when he had time. The young man told him that he looked quite drunk, so he paid in advance, and noted that he could not get his subordinate to pay for everything. Bishop Gemini said with a laugh that he was just about to pay with his card, but he thought that the guy was quite young, but already damn rude. The man in glasses understood perfectly well that in front of him was a genius who had managed to defeat the Spider Queen, and if he recruited him, then alcohol was just a pitiful price. He told the guy that they had relaxed a bit, and it was time to get to the main topic. The bishop said he had high hopes for the future, and told Lee that he had every chance of gaining rank, but that was not all he could do to earn the favor of their saint. And Gan thought that the fog that covers the mind control is practically invisible to anyone. The effect is not strong, but it makes you believe that idiot. The man with glasses said that the boy could become a cardinal, but that was not the end. The bishop noted that the most important thing that awaits the young man is, of course, wealth and fame. The man added that the guy will also receive the respect of the great leader of Gemini. All this can easily become his. The bishop did not stop talking. He extended his hand to Lee and told him to take it in order to be reborn as a follower of the constellation Gemini. The young man listened very attentively to the man in glasses without interrupting, and then began to laugh. Lee noted that he had been laughing too much lately, and then noted that that was exactly what Bishop Gemini wanted from him. And then they added that they wanted him to become another lackey of his worthless god. The man could not understand why the man was angry, because he had always behaved with him as expected, and he decided that he needed to change the subject and said that there was a misunderstanding. Someone outside the door said that he had brought them the relic he had won, and the bishop thought that this was very opportune. The man allowed entry, and the girl opened the door and apologized for disturbing him. She congratulated him on the purchase of the item and said that it belonged to Li Gang, also noted that all the certificates were ready. The guy thought that all this was so unusual. Bishop Gemini frowned and asked the boy if he had won one of Li Gan's relics. The young man replied that the man himself told him to choose whatever he wanted, and then added that it was not exactly what he was looking for, but it would certainly be useful to him. The guy with glasses thought that Stephen was obsessed with them, that they couldn't even afford to touch these relics, and said that she already had an owner.